I didn't realize anything was wrong until the library books started showing up at my house. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, a shipping error, or some mix-up at the local library. I'd come home from work and find a book in my mailbox with a printed receipt tucked inside. The books weren't ones I'd choose. Esoteric stuff about local history, alchemy, or ethics of artificial intelligence, but the receipts were always in my name. My library card number, my checkout history. I hadn't been to the library in years. I called to sort it out, but the librarian was polite and insistent. I had checked them out. She listed dates, times, and titles, all of which I had no memory of. My library card was still in the drawer where I'd left it years ago, gathering dust. I guess I've just been distracted lately, I said, laughing awkwardly, trying to hide the unease crawling up my spine. Her tone softened, but it carried an odd note. Maybe you're working too hard. It happens. When the fifth book showed up, it wasn't in the mailbox. It was on my bedside table. I didn't remember bringing it home. The receipt said I'd checked it out that morning. I try not to think about it, but the title, The Shadow Self, Exploring the Unknown Within, stuck with me. It felt pointed, as if whoever had chosen it wanted me to read it. The cover was an abstract illustration of a figure split in two. One side light, the other a void of swirling darkness. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't help myself. The book wasn't like anything I'd read before. The words felt like they were written for me, like they knew me in ways I didn't know myself. It described a feeling I couldn't put into words, the sense that there was something watching from the inside, something waiting. I didn't sleep that night. That's when the dreams started. They were vivid, more real than waking life. I'd find myself in strange places, an endless hallway lined with doors, a cold forest where the moonlight turned the trees into silver skeletons, a room with mirrors on every surface. But in the dreams, I was never alone. There was always someone else, not someone I could see exactly, more like an impression, a weight pressing against my thoughts. Sometimes I felt it in the pit of my stomach, a fluttering like trapped wings. Other times, it was a whisper so faint I couldn't make out the words. But no matter where I went in the dream, it followed me. One night, I found myself standing in my apartment. Everything was exactly as it should be. The dishes drying in the rack, the clock ticking softly on the wall. Except I wasn't the only one there. I turned and saw myself sitting on the couch. My double stared at me, expressionless. She looked like me, but her eyes, they were wrong. Too dark, like the pupils had swallowed the irises. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. Her voice was my voice, but it carried a sharpness mine never had. "This is my home," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt untrue. She stood slowly, deliberately, and I saw her hands trembling at her sides. Or were they mine? "You can't keep ignoring me," she said. "You've been pretending for too long. Do you even know who you are anymore?" I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I checked the couch, half expecting to see her sitting there, but of course, it was empty. The library book was still on the table, open to a page I hadn't reached yet. The paragraph was underlined in thick black ink. To confront the shadow is to confront the self. It will demand acknowledgement, and it will not wait forever. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering calls. Every time I tried to step outside, I felt a pull, a literal physical force, dragging me back into the apartment. I was terrified of falling asleep, terrified of what I might see, but staying awake was worse. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and I started hearing faint murmurs, like a crowded room just out of earshot. One night, I finally broke. I screamed into the empty apartment. "What do you want from me?" The answer came from my own mouth. "You already know." I clapped my hands over my lips, but the voice wasn't mine. It was deeper, resonant, and it vibrated in my chest like a second heartbeat. "Leave me alone," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "You invited me in." I didn't understand, not at first. But then the memories started surfacing. I'd been lying to myself, rewriting the past to keep it hidden. The strange feelings, the missing time, the flashes of faces I didn't recognize. Things I'd buried because they didn't make sense. But they made sense now. I'd gone to the library. I checked out the books. I'd started reading them. They weren't ordinary books. They were instructions, rituals. I'd been curious, too curious. I'd invited something in, something that had been waiting for someone like me. Now it wouldn't leave. I still don't know exactly what it is. A parasite? A shadow version of myself? A part of me I'd split off and try to forget? It doesn't matter anymore. I can feel it growing stronger every day, taking up more space in my mind, my body. I can feel my thoughts slipping away. My memories aren't mine anymore. The worst part? Sometimes I don't want it to stop. There's a dark comfort in surrendering, in letting it take over. The voice doesn't feel separate anymore. It feels like me, or maybe I'm becoming it. If you're reading this, it means I had a moment of clarity, long enough to write it down, long enough to warn you. Don't ask questions you're not ready to answer. Don't look too closely at the parts of yourself you've buried. Some things are better left unseen. And whatever you do, don't go to the library. It began with a phone call I didn't answer. It was 2:16 a.m., and I was deep in one of those dreamless sleeps that make you resent your alarm clock. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I jolted awake, the screen glowing with an unknown number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something about the timing, 2:16 exactly, made me pause. The buzzing stopped. No voicemail notification followed, just silence. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, my own reflection faintly visible in the glass. I set the phone down and rolled over, convincing myself it was just a wrong number. The next day, things were different. It was subtle at first. My morning routine felt slightly off, like the air in the apartment had thickened. When I walked into the kitchen, the coffee pot was already full, even though I distinctly remembered setting it to brew manually the night before. The keys I always left by the door had moved to the counter, and there was a voicemail notification on my phone that hadn't been there when I woke up. The message was static, pure white noise with occasional pops and clicks that made my skin crawl. At the end of the 30-second recording, there was a faint whisper, so faint I couldn't make it out. The logical part of my brain told me it was a glitch, a pocket dial, or some stray radio interference. But something deeper, older, told me to delete it immediately. I did. That night, the phone rang again. Same time, 2:16 a.m. This time, I answered. Hello. My voice was groggy, uncertain. There was a pause, then a click like someone pressing a button on an old tape recorder. A voice spoke, low and monotone, as if reading from a script. This is your final warning. Do not leave the house. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. Who is this? The line went dead. For a long time, I just sat there clutching the phone. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was some kind of prank, a bad joke. I even laughed nervously to convince myself. But the laugh didn't last long, because when I looked up, my bedroom door was open. I hadn't opened it. The next day at work, I tried to shake off the unease. The office was its usual bland self, full of fluorescent lights and hushed conversations. But even here, things felt wrong. My desk had moved slightly, just a few inches to the left. My coworker, Rachel, who always greeted me with a cheery "good morning," simply stared at me when I walked in. Not blankly, but like she was watching, assessing. When I finally sat down, my computer screen flickered. A file was open that I didn't recognize, titled Simply Listen. I clicked it. A low hum filled my headphones, growing louder with each passing second. My ears rang, my chest tightened, and I yanked the headphones off. The hum continued faintly from the computer speakers until I slammed the laptop shut. The rest of the day was a blur. By the time I got home, the warning from the phone call had faded into the background noise of my frazzled thoughts. I decided it had to be a coincidence, someone messing with me. I opened a bottle of wine, turned on some music, and tried to unwind. At exactly 2:16 a.m., I woke up. I hadn't set an alarm, and my phone wasn't ringing. But something had pulled me out of sleep. The house was silent. Too silent. Even the faint hum of the refrigerator was gone. I sat up, heart pounding. My bedroom door was open again, but this time I saw something. A shadow, standing perfectly still in the hallway. Not a person. There was no shape to it, no edges, just a dense absence of light. Who's there? I whispered. The shadow moved. Slowly, deliberately, it floated toward me, not walking, gliding, as if gravity had no hold on it. And then it spoke, in the same monotone voice I'd heard on the phone. You should have listened. Before I could scream, before I could even move, the shadow enveloped me. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and everything looked normal. My keys were by the door, the coffee pot was empty, and my phone was on the nightstand. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed it all. But then I checked my phone. There was a new voicemail. The same static-filled recording. The same faint whisper at the end. But this time I could make out the words. You're not where you're supposed to be. That's when I noticed the clock on the wall. It wasn't moving. Neither was the second hand on my watch. The world outside the window was frozen. Birds suspended mid-flight, leaves hanging in the air like someone had paused reality. I ran outside, heart pounding, but the moment I crossed the threshold, everything blurred. The world stretched and folded in on itself, like I was being pulled into a kaleidoscope. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my bed. It was 2:16 a.m. The phone was ringing. The train rattled into the station, shaking dust loose from the overhead lights. Mia stepped onto the platform, her boots clicking sharply against the cracked tiles. The station had the eerie quiet of small towns late at night, with only a handful of tired commuters waiting for their connections. She adjusted her scarf against the cold and checked her watch. The trip was impulsive, like most of her decisions these days. A midnight train to a city she hadn't been to in years, chasing the ghost of something she couldn't name. Nostalgia, maybe, or closure. She climbed aboard and found a seat by the window, dropping her bag beside her. As the train lurched forward, she caught her reflection in the glass. Pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, and that same searching look she'd worn since the breakup. No one tells you that heartbreak makes you restless, she thought. That it leaves you chasing distractions. New places, new faces, anything to fill the hours. For weeks, she had buried herself in work and meaningless routines, pretending she was fine. But then came the letter. It had arrived without warning, tucked neatly in her mailbox with no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable, though. Jake's, with his looping vowels and messy capitals. She had stared at it for hours before finally tearing it open. The note inside was short, just an address and a single line. You should know the truth. Mia had burned his things months ago. Letters, photos, even the record they used to play on Sunday mornings. She didn't want to carry pieces of him anymore. But this note had slipped through the cracks, arriving like a ghost she couldn't shake. Now, she was here, hurtling toward the address he'd written. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Apologies? Explanations? Some final twist to their story that would make it all make sense? The train screeched to a halt. Mia stepped off onto another empty platform, the air colder here, biting at her cheeks. The city was dark and quiet, its streets winding like veins through an unfamiliar body. She pulled out the note and entered the address into her phone. The building was old, the kind with creaky stairs and narrow hallways that smelled of mildew. Mia's boots echoed as she climbed to the third floor. Her breath was shallow, her heart pounding. She found the door, 3B, and hesitated. The light under the door was on. She knocked. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then came the sound of footsteps, the chain sliding off the latch. The door creaked open, and she came face to face with a stranger. He was younger than she expected, maybe late 20s, with messy hair and tired eyes. He looked at her with a mix of confusion and recognition. "Mia," he asked, his voice uncertain. She froze. "How do you know my name?" The man hesitated, then stepped aside. "You should come in." The apartment was small and cluttered, papers strewn across the coffee table, a half-empty mug of tea on the counter. Mia stayed near the door, her hand still clutching the note. "Who are you?" she asked. The man sat down on the couch, rubbing the back of his neck. "My name's Will," he said. "Jake's brother." Mia's breath caught. Jake had never mentioned a brother. She stared at Will, trying to reconcile this stranger with the man she used to know. "Why did you write me?" she asked, holding up the note. Will shook his head. "I didn't." "Jake did." "Jake's dead," Mia said, her voice sharper than she intended. "He's been dead for months." Will looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I know." The room felt impossibly small, the air too thick. Mia's mind raced, trying to piece together the meaning of this meeting, of the note, of Jake's ghost still reaching for her. "What's going on?" she demanded. Will sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Jake left this for you. He asked me to wait, to make sure you had time to process everything before I gave it to you." He reached for a box on the coffee table, a small wooden thing with a brass latch. Mia recognized it immediately. It was Jake's, a place where he kept old movie stubs and trinkets from their travels. Her throat tightened as Will handed it to her. "I don't want it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to," Will said softly. She sat down, the weight of the box heavy in her lap. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were things she hadn't seen in years. A Polaroid of them at a beach, a crumpled receipt from their first date, and a stack of letters tied with string. The top letter was addressed to her. She unfolded it, Jake's handwriting swimming before her eyes. "Mia, I know I hurt you. I know I left without giving you the answers you deserved. But there are things I couldn't tell you. Not then. Maybe not even now. I wasn't who you thought I was, and you weren't wrong to leave. But you were wrong about one thing. I did love you. More than anything. I hope you can forgive me. Jake." Her hands were shaking. She looked at Will, who was watching her carefully. "What is this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Will stood and crossed the room, pulling an envelope from a drawer. He handed it to her. It was Jake's handwriting again, but this one wasn't addressed to her. It was a will. The words blurred as she read them. Jake had left everything to her. His savings, his notebooks, even the dingy apartment Will had been living in. And at the bottom was a note in bold letters. "Don't let her think this was her fault." Mia's heart cracked open. Jake had always been good at leaving conversations unfinished, leaving promises unfulfilled, leaving her with questions she never thought she'd get answers to. But in this moment, sitting in a stranger's apartment, she realized he'd tried to leave something else behind, closure, or at least his version of it. She closed the box and stood, her legs unsteady. "I need some air," she said, heading for the door. Will didn't stop her. "He really did love you," he said softly as she left. The city was still dark, the streets empty. Mia walked until her legs ached, the weight of Jake's final words pressing against her chest. She wasn't sure if she forgave him yet, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. "The first time I noticed the light, I thought it was the neighbor's porch bulb. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, just a dim orange glow in the distance beyond my backyard. My house backed onto a stretch of woods, dense, quiet, and usually unremarkable. I had bought the place for the solitude, hoping to escape the grind of city life. For the first 6 months, the woods were exactly what I'd wanted. But then the light appeared. It wasn't there every night. Sometimes it would skip a day or two, but when it came, it always hovered in the same spot, just above the tree line. A lazy, flickering glow, like an old lantern swaying gently in someone's hand. I assumed it was a camper or a late-night hiker and didn't give it much thought. Until it started moving. I was standing in my kitchen one night, washing dishes and half watching the news, when I noticed the glow was closer than usual. It was weaving slowly through the trees, too deliberate for a person carrying a flashlight. I turned off the kitchen lights, peering through the window, and watched as the light seemed to glide, not bounce like someone walking. My chest tightened. The next morning, I walked out to the spot where I'd seen it. There were no signs of anyone passing through. No footprints, no broken branches, no ashes from a campfire. Just the usual stillness of the woods. I told myself I was being paranoid. Rural life was new to me. Maybe this was normal. That night, the light was back. Closer again. This time, it hovered near the edge of the woods, right where the tree line met my backyard. It flickered, dimmed, then flared as if trying to get my attention. I stepped onto the back porch, barefoot and clutching my phone like a lifeline, and squinted into the dark. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling slightly. "Who's out there?" The light stopped moving. It didn't fade or wink out. It just froze, glowing faintly in the distance. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. When it finally started to retreat, drifting back into the trees, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The pattern continued for weeks. The light would appear, moving a little closer each time. I started leaving the curtains drawn at night, pretending I couldn't feel its presence outside. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more insistent it became. One night, I heard something else, a faint tapping on the window. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic sound like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the glass. The bedroom window faced the woods. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see, but I couldn't stop myself. I inched toward the window, my breath shallow, and pulled the curtain back. The light was there, hovering just outside the window. It wasn't orange anymore. It was white, blindingly bright, and it wasn't flickering. It was pulsing like a heartbeat. For a moment, I thought I saw something inside it, a shape dark and indistinct, moving within the light. And then it disappeared. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I called the local sheriff. He listened patiently as I described the light and the tapping, but I could tell he didn't take me seriously. Probably someone messing around, he said. Kids from town. They like to scare newcomers. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew this wasn't kids. Whatever it was, it didn't feel human. The next few nights, I kept every light in the house on and slept with a baseball bat by my bed. The light didn't come back. I almost convinced myself it was over. But then, on the fifth night, I woke to a sound that sent ice through my veins. The back door creaking open. I grabbed the bat and crept downstairs, every step feeling like it stretched for miles. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the night breeze. I flipped on the porch light and stepped outside, my eyes darting to the tree line. The light was there again, but this time, it wasn't alone. There were two of them now, both glowing faintly, their movements slow and synchronized. They hovered side by side, drifting closer to the house. My hand tightened around the bat as I backed into the doorway. The light stopped at the edge of the yard, as if testing a boundary they couldn't cross. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Me, a trembling wreck clutching a weapon I wasn't sure I'd use, and them, silent and alien and impossibly still. Then the lights flared, brilliant and overwhelming, and I stumbled back, shielding my eyes. When I opened them again, they were gone. I moved out the next day, packed what I could carry, left a note for the landlord, and drove until the woods were far behind me. I didn't care about losing the deposit or explaining myself. I just needed to be away. That was 2 years ago. I live in the city now, where the streets are loud and bright, and there's no room for the dark to creep in. But sometimes, late at night, I think I see a faint glow in the distance, weaving between the buildings. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear that soft tapping on the glass. I noticed the absence before anything else. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. I was brushing my teeth one morning when I realized I hadn't heard the usual hum of traffic outside my apartment window. It wasn't just quiet. It was silent, like someone had pressed mute on the world. I pulled back the curtain and looked down at the street. Everything was where it should be. Parked cars, trees lining the sidewalk, the flickering open sign on the deli across the street. But there were no people, no movement. The deli owner, Mr. Kapoor, always unlocked his door at 7 a.m. sharp. He'd wave at me if I happened to glance down. Today, the sign flickered open, but the door stayed shut and the windows were dark. I told myself it was nothing, a holiday I'd forgotten maybe. But as I walked to work, the strangeness grew. The air had a static quality, faint but prickling against my skin, like the world itself was waiting. I passed a playground where the swings swayed gently in a wind I couldn't feel. The traffic lights cycled obediently from green to yellow to red, but no cars passed beneath them. The city felt hollow, like a diorama, perfectly constructed but fundamentally lifeless. When I got to the office, I was relieved to see people. Coworkers hunched over desks, phones pressed to their ears, fingers clacking against keyboards. The usual hum of productivity. But something was off. "Morning, Julie," I said as I passed my friend in the hallway. She didn't look up, just nodded vaguely, her eyes fixed on her laptop. I stopped at my desk, stared at her across the room. Normally, she'd have at least grunted a joke about my tardiness or asked me if I'd watched the latest episode of the trashy reality show we both secretly loved. Today, she just sat there, typing rhythmically, as if on autopilot. "Julie," I called out. Her head turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge me, but her face stayed blank. "Good morning," she said flatly, and turned back to her screen. By lunchtime, my unease had grown into full-blown dread. Everyone was polite, mechanical, efficient. But no one laughed, no one gossiped, no one complained about the broken coffee machine. The office chatter I took for granted was gone, replaced by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet clatter of keyboards. It wasn't until I was halfway through my sandwich that I noticed the clock. The second hand wasn't moving. I stared at it for a long moment, my pulse thundering in my ears. When I looked back at my coworkers, none of them seemed to notice. They kept typing, chewing, sipping coffee that had been cold for hours. I grabbed my bag and left. The streets were empty again. I turned a corner, and then another, until I was standing in a part of town I didn't recognize. The buildings here were all wrong. They stretched too high, their windows black and featureless, as if the architects had forgotten to finish them. Shadows pooled unnaturally in the alleys, refusing to shift as the sun moved overhead. I passed a bookstore with a handwritten sign in the window that read, "Back soon." When I peered inside, I saw rows of shelves, every one of them bare. No books, no registers, no furniture. Just emptiness. That's when I saw the man. He stood at the far end of the block, his back to me. He was tall, wearing a black coat that hung oddly on his frame, as if it didn't quite fit. His head was tilted forward, and I thought maybe he was looking at something in his hands. But as I took a step closer, I realized his arms were hanging limply at his sides. "Hello," I called out, my voice too loud in the quiet. He turned slowly, almost reluctantly. His face wasn't a face. It was blank, smooth, like someone had sanded it down to featureless skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. And yet I felt it looking at me. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, the door locked and bolted behind me. My chest heaved, my legs trembling. The silence pressed in again, heavier now. I turned on the TV for some background noise, but the screen only flickered static. Every channel was the same. When I checked my phone, the messages on my screen didn't make sense. My friend Hannah had sent me a string of texts, but they were just wrong. Fragments of sentences that didn't connect. "They don't. Lost the not where you're." The last message was just a single word. "Run." I dropped the phone. My apartment didn't feel safe anymore. I checked the locks again, but the windows were open. I didn't remember opening them. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, clutching a knife from the kitchen drawer, watching the shadows on the walls shift and twist in ways they shouldn't. The man in the black coat stood outside my window, motionless, featureless, waiting. The next morning, everything was back to normal. The streets were bustling. Mr. Kapoor waved at me from the deli. Julie greeted me with a sarcastic comment about my lateness. The clock in the office ticked forward, second by second. But the sense of wrongness lingered, like a faint stain I couldn't scrub away. I still see the man sometimes, at the edge of the park, standing at the back of the subway car, reflected in windows where he shouldn't be. No one else notices him, and sometimes when the world falls silent, I wonder if this is the real loop. Maybe I didn't escape. Maybe I never would. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it was definitely coming from somewhere in my building. I lived in an old, 3-story walk-up with thin walls and creaky floors, so noises carried, but this was different. It didn't sound like a muffled TV or a heated argument. It sounded raw, deep, heaving sobs that made my chest tighten just hearing them. I first noticed it one night when I was brushing my teeth. At first, I thought it was a stray cat outside, but when I opened my bathroom window to check, the sound stayed exactly the same. Close but indistinct, like it was coming from somewhere inside the building. The next night, I heard it again. It started around 11 p.m., just as I was getting into bed. Same low, heart-wrenching sobbing, but now it seemed closer, like it was coming from the hallway. I opened my apartment door, hesitant, and stepped out. The corridor was empty, the dim overhead light flickering slightly. The crying stopped the moment I looked out, replaced by an unsettling silence. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the sound. It lingered in my mind, tugging at something primal, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The third night, I decided to find the source. It was nearly midnight when the crying began again, and I followed it barefoot and clutching a flashlight. The sound led me down the hall to the stairwell and then up to the third floor. My building only had a few tenants, and I rarely saw any of them. Most people kept to themselves, but as I climbed the stairs, the crying grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just sobbing. It was a woman's voice, choked and desperate, like she was begging for something. When I reached the top floor, the sound stopped abruptly. I stood there, flashlight beam trembling against the walls, my breath loud in the silence. There were 3 apartments on this floor. One belonged to an older couple who were always out of town, the other to a guy I'd seen once or twice carrying boxes, and the third, I didn't know. I'd never seen anyone go in or out. The door to that third apartment was slightly ajar. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the narrow gap. Inside, it was dark, not a single light on. I pushed the door open a little further and immediately froze. The apartment was empty. Not empty like someone had moved out, but empty like no one had ever lived there. The walls were bare, the floors scuffed, and there wasn't a single piece of furniture or decoration. But in the center of the room, there was something that made my stomach drop. A single wooden chair facing the window. On it was a cassette recorder, an old model with chunky buttons and a plastic casing. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath me. The crying had stopped completely, replaced by the faint hum of city noise through the window. I approached the chair cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and leave. On top of the cassette recorder was a tape, already loaded. My fingers trembled as I pressed play. The crying started again, the same sobs I'd been hearing for days, and then the voice, "Please help me, please." The desperation in her tone made my chest tighten. The recording continued, the woman begging, sobbing, her voice rising and falling in waves of despair. And then, abruptly, she said, "He's here." The tape stopped. I whipped around, the flashlight beam slicing through the empty room. My breath was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door to the apartment was still open, but the hallway beyond it seemed darker than before, the shadows longer and deeper. I grabbed the recorder and ran. When I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the recorder, but I rewound the tape and listened again, desperate to understand. The crying, the begging, and then, right at the end, faint but unmistakable, the sound of heavy footsteps. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the recorder on my coffee table, staring at it like it might spring to life. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Sleep deprivation, a prank by some bored neighbor, maybe even an echo of something from the street. But when I tried to play the tape again, it was blank. Just static. The crying didn't stop, though. Over the next few nights, I heard it everywhere. In the hallway, the stairwell, even faintly through the vents in my apartment. Once, I woke up to it and realized it was coming from right outside my bedroom door. My locks were intact, and there was no sign of anyone breaking in, but the sound was unmistakable. I decided to leave. On my last day in the apartment, I ran into the building's maintenance man, a grizzled older guy named Pete who'd worked there for decades. I asked him about the empty unit on the third floor. Pete's expression darkened. "That place," he said, shaking his head. "Ain't nobody lived there in years. Last tenant was some young woman, quiet thing. She went missing, 10 years ago? Police never found her, but folks around here say she had a boyfriend. Real controlling type. Guy vanished the same night she did." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sometimes people say they hear things up there." Pete continued, his voice low. "Crying mostly, but it's just the pipes. Old building, you know?" I nodded, but I didn't believe him. That night, as I drove away from the building, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the window of the third-floor apartment, watching me leave. I don't know if the crying ever stopped, but I do know I'll never go back to find out. When the storm rolled in, it wasn't like the ones we were used to. It wasn't loud, angry, or dramatic. It didn't announce itself with thunderclaps or lightning slicing through the sky. No, this storm crept in, silent and suffocating, a curtain of gray that swallowed the horizon. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late to leave. I was working the late shift at the gas station on Route 17. Nothing fancy, just a single pump, a register that never worked right, and a fridge full of expired energy drinks. On a normal night, my only company was the buzzing fluorescent light above the counter and the occasional trucker stopping in for coffee that tasted like regret. But this wasn't a normal night. The first sign was the static. My phone, the ancient radio behind the counter, even the old TV I'd rigged up to play DVDs. It all went dead at the same time. 1 second, Johnny Cash was crooning about falling into a burning ring of fire, and the next, silence. The kind that presses on your ears like a weight, making you hyper-aware of your own breathing. I stepped outside, hoping it was just a blown fuse or a freak electrical glitch. That's when I saw it. The storm wasn't just on the horizon anymore. It was everywhere, a dense, swirling fog that clung to the ground like it was alive. It had an unnatural heaviness to it, almost like it was pressing down on the world. And it was moving, slowly but deliberately, rolling across the asphalt toward the station. A pair of headlights pierced through the fog, and a beat-up pickup truck pulled into the lot. The driver, an older man with a weathered face and a John Deere cap, stumbled out, looking around nervously. "Hell of a storm, huh?" I called out, trying to sound casual even though my stomach was doing backflips. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the fog, then at me. His eyes were wide, glassy, like he'd seen something he couldn't quite process. "You got a close-up shop," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Get out while you still can." I laughed nervously. Yeah, I don't think my boss would." "Your boss ain't here," he snapped, cutting me off. "Just listen to me, kid. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone. And for God's sake, don't go outside." Before I could respond, he climbed back into his truck, threw it into reverse, and disappeared into the fog. The taillights faded quickly, swallowed by the gray, until there was nothing left but darkness. I stood there for a moment, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or anticipation. The storm was closer now, the fog brushing up against the edge of the lot like a curious animal. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The gas station felt smaller than usual, the buzzing of the fluorescent light louder. I paced behind the counter, my eyes flicking to the windows every few seconds. The fog pressed against the glass, soft tendrils curling and shifting as if searching for a way in. And then I saw it, a figure in the fog. It was faint at first, barely more than a shadow. But as it moved closer, it became clearer. Tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its head tilted to one side, as if it were studying the building. Studying me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the figure moved closer, its movements fluid but wrong, like a marionette with invisible strings. It stopped just outside the window, its face, or what I thought might be its face, hidden in the swirling gray. I don't know what possessed me to move, but I grabbed the bat we kept under the counter and held it tight, the wood slick with sweat from my palms. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The figure didn't move. It just stood there waiting, watching, and then, without warning, it was gone. Not like it walked away or disappeared into the fog. It just wasn't. The relief was short-lived. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, not outside but inside. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, vibrating in my chest. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging the station into darkness. I gripped the bat tighter, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. The only light came from the faint glow of the fog seeping through the windows. And then I heard it. A knock. Soft at first, then louder, insistent. "Help me," a voice called from outside. A woman's voice, trembling and weak. "Please, I'm lost. I need help." My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put. But the voice, it sounded so real, so desperate. "Please," she called again, sobbing now. "I am scared." I stepped closer to the door, the bat still in my hand. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer, just the sound of her crying. I reached for the lock, my hand hovering over it. Something wasn't right. The crying, it was the same pitch, the same rhythm, like a recording on loop. And then, through the glass, I saw it. The figure again, standing just behind the fog, watching, waiting. I backed away, my chest tightening as the crying grew louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the hum of something I couldn't name. The last thing I remember is the door rattling, the sound of nails scraping against the glass. And then nothing, just darkness. I woke up at dawn, sprawled on the floor behind the counter. The lights were back on, the fog gone, the world outside bright and crisp as if nothing had happened. But it had. I could still feel it, the weight of the storm, the presence in the fog. And I knew it wasn't over, because as I reached for the keys to lock up, I saw it. A single handprint on the glass, impossibly large, pressed against the inside of the door. I never thought much about light bulbs until one started to go out in my apartment. You know, the flickering kind, the ones that seem fine during the day, but stutter and buzz in the dark, as if they're whispering some secret message. It was the kitchen light over the sink. Every time I turned it on, it flickered a few times before settling into a dim, sullen glow. I wasn't in a rush to replace it. I just moved in, and between unpacking boxes and figuring out my new job, the light bulb seemed like a problem for another day. The thing is, it wasn't just the flickering. It made a sound, a faint, irregular buzzing that didn't match the rhythm of the light. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. I told myself it was the wiring. The building was old, with walls so thin I could hear my upstairs neighbor's TV and the couple across the hall arguing about groceries. Bad wiring wasn't a stretch. The first time the buzzing changed, I was washing dishes. My hands were covered in soap, the faucet running, when the buzz shifted pitch. It wasn't a random electrical hum anymore. It was sharper, almost melodic, like it was trying to form a pattern. I froze, my hands dripping, and stared at the bulb as it pulsed in time with the sound. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. A rhythm, deliberate and wrong. I turned off the light, but the sound didn't stop. It was fainter now, as if retreating into the walls, but it didn't disappear completely. I left the kitchen, went to bed, and told myself I'd deal with it in the morning. The next day, I bought a new bulb. It wasn't until I unscrewed the old one that I noticed it felt warm, warmer than it should have been, considering the light had been off for hours. I didn't think much of it, just swapped it out and threw the old bulb in the trash. For the first time in days, the kitchen light worked normally. No flickering, no buzzing, just blessed silence. But the buzzing came back that night. It wasn't in the kitchen anymore. It was in the living room, faint and intermittent, like a fly trapped in the walls. I walked the perimeter of the room, pressing my ear against the plaster, but I couldn't pinpoint the source. It seemed to move, shifting from one side of the room to the other, as if it were following me. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought they were tricks of the light, branches swaying outside, headlights passing by. But the living room window faced an alley, and the shadows didn't move like branches or headlights. They flickered, sharp and staccato, in sync with the buzzing. And they weren't where shadows should have been. One darted across the ceiling, another along the baseboards, quick and jagged, like something skittering just out of sight. I turned on every light in the apartment, the TV, the radio, anything to drown out the sound and chase away the dark. It didn't help. The buzzing got louder, and the shadows kept moving. That night, I slept with the lights on and a blanket pulled over my head. The next morning, I called my landlord. I told him the wiring was acting up, that I was hearing strange noises. He grunted something about getting an electrician out next week. I could tell he didn't care. I didn't blame him. I barely believed myself. Over the next few days, the buzzing spread. It was in the bedroom, the bathroom, even the hallway. Sometimes it was so faint I could convince myself I'd imagined it, but other times it was deafening. The shadows grew bolder too. They darted in the corners of my vision, impossible to pin down, but unmistakably there. Once, I thought I saw something crouched in the corner of the kitchen, a silhouette of spindly limbs and a too long neck, but when I turned, it was gone. I stopped turning off the lights. Even then, the buzzing didn't stop. I thought about moving, breaking my lease, but every time I tried to pack, the sound would intensify. My vision blurred, my head pounded, and I couldn't concentrate long enough to fold a shirt. It was like the apartment didn't want me to leave. One night, the living room bulb exploded. I was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when the light flared so brightly I saw afterimages burned into my vision. Then it shattered, plunging the room into darkness. The buzzing filled the air, so loud it felt like my skull would crack. The shadows moved in the periphery, faster now, darting toward me and away like they were testing the edges of my space. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and grabbed my phone for light. As soon as I turned on the flashlight, the shadows disappeared. The buzzing stopped, but something else was there. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw the broken bulb lying on the floor, its shards scattered like glittering teeth. And in the middle of it was something. It looked like a filament, but wrong, too thick with tendrils that twitched and coiled like it was alive. As I watched, it curled in on itself, retreating into the base of the shattered bulb, and disappeared. I left that night. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my phone, and walked out the door. I didn't care that it was nearly midnight, that I didn't have a plan. I just needed to get out. The next day, I called my landlord from a friend's place and told him I was breaking the lease. I didn't go back for my stuff. I didn't care about the deposit. That was 6 months ago. I've moved twice since then, trying to shake the feeling that it followed me. For a while, I thought I was safe. But last night, my bathroom light started flickering, and in the silence that followed, I thought I heard the faintest buzz. I didn't start noticing it until I quit my job. One moment, I was cleaning out my desk at the office, packing up my photos, sticky notes, and a mug that said "World's Okayest Employee," and the next, I was standing in my living room. Not driving home, not walking through the door. Just there. I laughed at first. Stress does weird things to your memory, right? I probably zoned out during the commute, and my brain skipped recording it. A little unnerving, sure, but explainable. That's what I told myself. The next time it happened, I wasn't so sure. I'd gone to the grocery store because the fridge was bare except for some condiments and a half-empty carton of oat milk. I remember vividly stepping into the produce section. I grabbed a basket, looked at the bananas, and then I was back in my kitchen, staring at an empty counter. No groceries. No receipt. No basket. Just me, hands shaking, still clutching my keys. I sat down and tried to piece it together. I even checked my phone to see if I'd taken photos or sent messages in between, but there was nothing. I considered calling someone, my mom, my ex, anyone, but how do you even explain something like that without sounding crazy? Instead, I ordered takeout and went to bed early. I told myself I was just tired, that it was all some kind of glitch in my brain. Maybe my body was going through the motions of life without me. Maybe I needed more sleep. But then the days started disappearing. I woke up one morning and the calendar on my phone said it was Friday. That couldn't be right. Thursday had just started, hadn't it? I checked my emails, my messages, my bank account. The evidence was all there. Food delivery charges I didn't remember making, Netflix shows I'd apparently binge-watched, even a streak of texts with my friend Nate. Nate, hope you're feeling better today, man. Me? All good, thanks. Nate, call if you need anything, all right? Me? Will do. I didn't even remember texting him, much less what he was asking about. What had happened yesterday, or the day before that? What was I missing? My stomach churned with a deep, gnawing unease. It wasn't just the time I'd lost that scared me. It was the thought that I'd been there, doing things, but some other version of me was in charge. I decided I needed proof. That night, I set up my phone to record myself sleeping. If something was happening while I was out, I wanted to know. I woke up groggy the next morning, like I hadn't rested at all, and immediately grabbed the phone. The video was still recording, and the thumbnail looked normal. Just me lying in bed. But as I scrubbed through the footage, I froze. Around 3:12 a.m., my body sat up. The movements were stiff, jerky, like a marionette being yanked to life. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, but my face, it wasn't right. I wasn't smiling, exactly, but my lips twitched, just slightly, as though the act of existing in my skin amused me. My body stood there for a long moment, staring at the camera, unmoving. Then, without breaking eye contact, I leaned in, reached for the phone, and turned it off. The video ended. I dropped the phone and scrambled away from the bed, while rising in my throat. I didn't remember any of it, but there I was on the screen, staring at myself like some stranger wearing my face. My skin crawled. I wanted to scream, to smash the phone, to do something, but I didn't know where to start. The worst part? The phone wasn't on my nightstand where I'd left it. It was in the kitchen. From that day on, I started keeping notes. Sticky notes on the fridge, journal entries on my laptop, anything I could do to track myself. But every morning, half the notes were gone, and the ones that stayed didn't make sense. One day, I woke up to find the phrase, "Who are you?" scrawled on a note in my own handwriting, taped to my bathroom mirror. The day after, there was a single word typed into my journal. Why? I try to stay awake at night, but no matter how hard I fought, my body gave out. Every morning, there were gaps, holes in my memory, new questions I couldn't answer. My friends started noticing too. Nate told me I'd bailed on plans without explanation, plans I didn't even remember making. Another friend said I called her at 2 a.m., crying, and hung up before she could figure out what was wrong. I was unraveling, and then I found the notebook. It was tucked under my couch cushion, a plain black spiral notebook I didn't recognize. Inside were pages and pages of frantic scrawls in my handwriting. Some were messages, others were drawings, eyes, doors, spirals that seemed to go on forever. But one page stuck out. Written in the middle of a blank sheet, in all caps, were the words, "You're not alone." I felt sick. My stomach clenched, and I threw the notebook across the room. It landed on the floor with a thud, pages fluttering. And then I heard it, a knock at the door. Not the front door, the closet door. The one I never used because it was too small, too cramped, too full of old junk. I don't remember crossing the room. One moment, I was frozen in place, staring at the door. The next, I was standing in front of it, hand trembling on the knob. When I opened it, the closet was empty. No clothes, no boxes, just a narrow, dark hallway stretching far beyond what should have been the back wall. The air was cold and damp, and the smell, like wet earth and rust, made my head spin. A voice whispered from the darkness, soft but clear. "Do you remember now?" I slammed the door and stumbled back, heart pounding. But when I turned around, the notebook was on the couch again, open to a blank page. The pen was resting beside it, and as I watched, it started to move, scratching out a single word. "Soon." I haven't opened the closet since. I haven't slept. I don't know if I'm losing time or if time is losing me. But I keep hearing it, whispers in the walls, in the back of my head, in the spaces where silence used to be. Something's waiting for me. Something I can't escape. And I think it's wearing my faith. I first noticed something was wrong when my name started changing. Not legally, not officially. I'm still Elliot Hawthorne on every piece of ID in my wallet. But out there, in the world, my name shifts like a shadow under a cloud. Last Monday, the barista at the corner cafe called me Ethan as she handed over my coffee. I corrected her, and she frowned. "Oh, sorry," she said, drawing out the word like she didn't believe me. "You just look like an Ethan." Tuesday, a coworker left a sticky note on my desk that said, "Elijah, the file's ready." I laughed, assuming it was a joke, but when I asked her about it, she swore she'd written Elliot. I held up the note, her handwriting undeniable, but she just stared at it, her face going pale. "I didn't write that," she whispered. By Wednesday, the people closest to me were slipping up. My girlfriend called me Evan during dinner. My mother addressed an email to Eli. When I pointed it out, they got defensive, insisting they'd said the right name, as if I was gaslighting them. It wasn't just my name. By Thursday, my entire life seemed to be mutating, subtly but unmistakably. The restaurant where I always grabbed lunch served me a sandwich I'd never ordered before. except the cashier swore it was my usual. The bus stop I'd used for years was suddenly 2 blocks closer to my apartment. My favorite jacket, a battered leather thing I'd owned since college, turned up in my closet pristine, as though it had never been worn. And then there was the photo. I found it tucked between the pages of a book I'd been reading, though I'd never seen it before. It showed me, at least I think it was me, standing on the edge of a cliff, the ocean roaring behind me. I was smiling, my arms slung around the shoulders of a man I didn't recognize. He looked familiar in a way that made my stomach turn, like a song you almost remember but can't name. The back of the photo was blank. I confronted my girlfriend that night, desperate for some kind of anchor. "Do you think I've been acting different?" I asked. She gave me a long, searching look. "I don't know," she said finally. "Have you?" That wasn't the answer I needed. By Friday, the world felt like it was fraying at the edges. I walked into the office and found a stranger sitting at my desk, typing away like he belonged there. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up, startled. "Oh, sorry, Elijah," he said. "I thought you were out today." "I'm Elliot," I snapped. His brow furrowed. "Right? Sorry, Elliot." He dragged my name out, the syllables strange in his mouth. I checked my email, and half the messages were addressed to Elijah. One was signed by someone named Reese, someone I'd never heard of, yet apparently we'd been corresponding for weeks. I called my mom again that afternoon, hoping for reassurance, but her voicemail message was different. It was still her voice, but the words were wrong. "Hi, this is Sarah. Leave a message for me or Elijah, and we'll get back to you." Sarah? Her name is Karen. It's always been Karen. By Saturday, I couldn't leave my apartment. The outside world felt hostile, full of people I knew but who didn't quite know me. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from names I didn't recognize. One text read, "Ethan, meet us at the usual spot tonight. Bring the photo." I threw my phone across the room. That night, the knocking started. 3 sharp raps on my front door just past midnight. I froze, my heart hammering. When I finally worked up the nerve to look through the peephole, the hallway was empty. But as I turned back toward the living room, I heard it again, this time on the window. I live on the 6th floor. The knocking came faster now, urgent, insistent, like a hand pounding against glass. I backed away, trembling, and tripped over something on the floor. The photo. It was lying face up, though I was sure I'd left it in the kitchen. Except now it had changed. The man beside me on the cliff was gone. In his place stood someone else, a figure cloaked in shadow. Their face was indistinct, blurred, as though the camera hadn't focused properly. But their hand rested on my shoulder, and I could feel its weight. The knocking stopped. Sunday morning, I woke up to find my apartment transformed. The furniture was arranged differently. The walls painted a color I hated. My bookshelves held titles I'd never read, written by authors I didn't recognize. My phone was gone, replaced by a model I'd never owned. I checked the mirror, half expecting to see someone else staring back. It was still my face, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. The stubble on my jaw was too neat. My hair a shade darker than I remembered. My eyes looked like they belonged to a stranger. I stepped outside, clutching the photo like a talisman. The street was familiar but wrong. The buildings taller, the storefronts rearranged. No one looked at me as I walked past, not even the barista who had known my name a week ago. At the corner, I stopped, staring at my reflection in a shop window. The man from the photo was standing beside me, his shadow stretching long and thin against the glass. He smiled, and I smiled back. I used to deliver pizzas during my first year out of high school. It was a dead-end job, but it paid just enough to keep gas in my old Civic and some cash in my pocket. Most nights were the same, speeding through quiet neighborhoods, dodging tipsy partiers, and handing off greasy boxes to tired families. But there was this one delivery, one I'll never forget, that still makes my stomach twist whenever I think about it. It was a Thursday night, nearing the end of my shift. The order came in just before closing, a single large pepperoni to an address I didn't recognize, way out in the sticks. My manager, Dave, handed me the slip with a shrug. "Weird one," he said. "Cash order. No phone number." I glanced at the address. It was miles outside our usual delivery zone, but I figured Dave was too tired to argue with whoever placed it. I wasn't thrilled about driving into the middle of nowhere, but I'd get overtime for the trip. So I loaded up the pizza, punched the address into my GPS, and headed out. The drive was strange from the start. The route took me farther and farther from the town, the streetlights becoming sparse until they disappeared altogether. My GPS kept losing signal, rerouting every few minutes, but I didn't think much of it. It was a rural area. Spotty service was normal. Eventually, I turned onto a narrow dirt road, lined with trees so thick they blotted out the moonlight. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under my tires. The house appeared out of nowhere. It was old, sagging under the weight of its own history, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. A single light bulb hung above the front porch, casting a dim yellow glow. I parked the car, hesitating for a moment before grabbing the pizza. My gut was telling me to leave, but I couldn't exactly go back empty-handed. The porch creaked under my weight as I approached the door. There was no doorbell, just a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. I knocked twice and waited. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. "Pizza delivery." The door opened a crack, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness beyond. A man's voice, low and gravelly, came from inside. "Come in." I froze. I'm not supposed..." "Come in," the voice repeated, firmer this time. The door swung open wider, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my nose sting. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. "Where should I put this?" I asked, holding up the pizza like a shield. "In the kitchen," the voice said. It came from deeper in the house now, farther than it should have. I couldn't see anyone, just shadows stretching across the floor. The hallway felt impossibly long. The walls were lined with old, faded portraits, stern-faced men and women in outdated clothes, their eyes following me as I moved. My footsteps sounded wrong, like the house was swallowing the sound. The kitchen was empty, except for a small, round table in the center. I placed the pizza down, eager to leave. But as I turned to go, I noticed something odd. The table was covered in old newspapers, all of them yellowed with age. My eyes caught a headline from the top one. "Local man disappears after strange delivery." My stomach dropped. I leaned closer, scanning the article. The man's name wasn't familiar, but the details were a pizza delivery driver, last seen heading to an address out in the woods. His car was found abandoned a week later, no trace of him anywhere. The date on the paper was from 10 years ago. Before I could process it, I heard the door slam behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but no one was there. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the light bulb above the table. Then the whispers started, soft at first like wind brushing through leaves. They grew louder, overlapping and echoing, coming from every direction. My name was in there, buried beneath the chaos. I swear I heard it. I bolted, sprinting down the hallway. Past the staring portraits, I felt the air grow heavier, like the house itself was trying to hold me back. The front door was farther than it should have been, the hallway stretching as I ran. By the time I reached it, I was gasping for breath. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked at the handle, pounding on the wood, screaming for help. The whispers grew louder, closing in. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy, gripping me just enough to send a jolt of terror through my body. I didn't look back. With one last desperate pull, the door flew open, and I stumbled onto the porch. The night air hit me like a wave, sharp and freezing. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I sprinted to my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. The house loomed in my rearview mirror as I sped down the dirt road, its porch light flickering like a dying star. When I got back to the restaurant, Dave was closing up. He frowned when he saw me. "Where's the money?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much to even pull the keys from the ignition. The next day, I tried to pull up the address on my GPS, but it didn't exist. I drove out there anyway, convinced I'd find it. The road was there, but the house wasn't. Just an overgrown lot, the kind that hadn't seen life in decades. I quit the job a week later, but sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I'll catch a glimpse of a porch light in the distance, flickering in the woods where it shouldn't be. And for a split second, I'll hear those whispers again, calling me back. I've always been a light sleeper. Every creak of the floor, the faintest murmur of wind through the window, it all wakes me up. So when I moved into a small, third-floor apartment in the city, I braced myself for sleepless nights filled with the sounds of neighbors, traffic, and life in close quarters. But the building was surprisingly quiet, unnaturally quiet. At first, I thought I'd gotten lucky. The walls were thick, muffling any sound from the adjacent units, and the windows were well insulated against the din of the street below. I couldn't hear a thing from anyone else, not even footsteps in the hallway or doors opening and closing. Even the old radiator, which should have clanged and hissed, stayed eerily silent. I've been living there for about a week when I first noticed the sound. It started as a faint tapping, like someone drumming their fingers lightly against a wooden surface. It was so soft I almost didn't register it, but as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, it became impossible to ignore. The sound was coming from the wall behind my bed, the wall that separated my unit from the next. I assumed it was my neighbor, maybe moving furniture or knocking something against the wall by accident. I didn't think much of it, until the next night, when it happened again. This time, the tapping came in a pattern. 3 taps, pause, 4 taps, pause, 1 tap, then silence. I sat up in bed, listening intently, but the sound didn't return. I told myself it was nothing, a random noise, pipes expanding, or the building settling. City apartments were full of weird quirks, after all. The tapping continued over the next few nights, always around the same time, always with the same odd patterns. By the 5th night, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to talk to my neighbor. I hadn't seen much of them yet, just glimpses of a tall, shadowy figure coming and going at odd hours, but I figured they wouldn't mind me asking about the noise. I knocked on their door the next morning. No answer. The landlord happened to be walking by, so I asked him about it. "Oh, that unit?" he said, frowning slightly. "No one's lived there for months. Been empty since the last tenant broke their lease." I laughed, assuming he was mistaken. "No, someone's definitely there. I've seen them." The landlord just shrugged. "Nope. No keys checked out. No new tenant agreements." I know. They gave me pause, but I brushed it off. You had to be wrong. I decided I'd try knocking again that evening. Maybe they just hadn't been home. That night, as I lay in bed, the tapping started again. This time, I didn't stay frozen in place. I got up, pressing my ear against the wall. The tapping was clearer now. Rhythmic. Deliberate. It sounded too precise to be random. 3 taps. Pause. 4 taps. Pause. 1 tap. Pause. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the wall before I knocked back. 3 times. The tapping stopped. I stayed there, heart racing, waiting to see what would happen next. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, I heard a voice. "Help me." It was so soft I thought I might have imagined it. I pressed my ear harder against the wall, straining to hear. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. It sounded distorted, like it was being spoken through water, but it was unmistakably real. I yanked my head back from the wall, my pulse pounding. The sound came again, this time not as a voice, but as something scraping against the wall. Long, slow, deliberate scratches like fingernails dragging across wood. I couldn't stay in that room. I grabbed my phone and bolted to the living room, turning on every light I could. I didn't sleep at all that night, and the next morning, I went straight to the landlord, demanding to see the empty unit next door. He looked annoyed, but I must have seemed desperate because he finally agreed. He unlocked the door to 3B and stepped aside, letting me enter first. The air inside was stale and cold, with that distinct smell of abandonment. The walls were bare, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. It looked untouched, like no one had been there in years, except for the wall opposite me, the one that connected to my bedroom. There were scratches on it, deep, jagged marks, as if someone had clawed at it with desperate force. My stomach churned as I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed the paper stuck to the wall, pinned with a rusted nail. It was an old photograph, black and white, the edges curling with age. It showed a group of people standing in front of a building that looked like this one. In the back row, partially obscured, was a woman with a hauntingly familiar face. It was me. I staggered back, clutching my stomach, and that's when I saw it. The writing on the back of the photo scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Help her before it's too late." The landlord asked if I was okay, but I didn't respond. I left the building that day and never went back. I didn't even bother to pack my things. Months later, I tried to look up the building's history. I found an article about a fire in the 1940s that had gutted the third floor. Several people had died, including a woman whose body was found clawing at the wall of her apartment, trying to escape. Her name wasn't listed. I don't know what I experienced in that apartment or what the tapping meant, but sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of faint scratching. And I can't help but wonder if she's still trapped in that room, calling for help, or if she followed. The laundromat always smelled faintly of detergent and burnt toast. Sasha had no idea why the toast part was there. There wasn't a toaster in sight, but it was as constant as the hum of the machines. She usually came late when the place was quiet, just her and the rows of old washers that shook like they were about to vibrate straight into another dimension. That night started like any other. She hauled her laundry bag onto the folding table, plopped in a few quarters, and stared at the drum, spinning her mismatched socks into a dizzying blur. It was soothing in a mindless way, like the whole world had reduced itself to one small, manageable task. Then the machine stopped. Not just her machine, all of them. The hum died, leaving the kind of silence that felt too loud. Sasha frowned and checked her phone. Still plenty of time on the cycle. She glanced around for the attendant, but the booth was empty, the small TV flickering static. "Hey, anyone here?" she called out. Her voice echoed faintly against the tiled walls. And then she saw it. A sock pressed flat against the glass of her washer, but not like it had just fallen there. It was plastered, stuck unnaturally, its fabric stretched thin. As she watched, it slowly peeled away, disappearing into the shadows at the back of the machine. Sasha took a step back, heart hammering. "No, no, no." She was halfway to the door when the lights flickered, plunging the laundromat into a stuttering dance of brightness and dark. When they finally stabilized, something had changed. The washers weren't empty anymore. They were full, but not with clothes. Faces stared back at her. Not reflections, but faces pressed against the glass from the inside. Wide, unblinking eyes, mouths slack and silent. Their features were smeared, as though they'd been printed onto the surface and dragged downward. Sasha froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. She pushed harder, slamming her shoulder against it. But it was like trying to move a brick wall. Behind her, the washers began to turn, their drums creaking slowly to life. The faces inside moved with them, sliding around like puppets on invisible strings. Some mouths twitched, their lips pulling into grotesque attempts at smiles. "You left something behind," a voice said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even human. It came from everywhere at once, low and distorted, as if the air itself were speaking. Sasha spun around, her eyes darting between the washers. "I didn't leave anything," she shouted, though her voice cracked with fear. "I don't even know what you're talking about." The voice didn't respond. Instead, one of the dryers banged loudly, its metal door popping open. Inside was something that definitely wasn't hers, a book. Its leather cover was cracked and old, its spine warped like it had been soaked and dried 100 times over. The title, etched faintly in gold, was in a language she couldn't read. Against her better judgment, she picked it up. The laundromat seemed to sigh, the air shifting as if it had been holding its breath. The washers stopped spinning. The faces disappeared. For a moment, Sasha thought it was over. Then the book opened on its own. Its pages flipped wildly, as though caught in a violent wind, despite the stillness of the room. When they stopped, the paper glowed faintly, illuminating words that began to rearrange themselves into English before her eyes. The debt was paid. The cycle continues. Return what is owed. or be taken. What does that even mean? Sasha whispered, clutching the book tighter. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of this nightmare. The washers answered. They started again, but this time, they weren't filled with faces. They were filled with her. Dozens of versions of herself, pressed against the glass, pounding and screaming. Each one mouthed the same word, over and over, run. The book pulsed in her hands, its warmth spreading like fire. The words on the page began to melt, dripping into symbols she couldn't decipher. She had the sudden, terrible realization that it wasn't a warning, it was a contract. The voice returned, louder now. The one who washes cannot leave until the load is clean. Sasha didn't understand, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to stick around to find out. She hurled the book back into the dryer and ran, slamming herself into the door until, miraculously, it gave way. The cool night air hit her like a slap. She stumbled into the empty street, gasping, and didn't stop running until she was 3 blocks away. When she finally looked back, the laundromat was dark. No flickering lights. No, just an empty, ordinary building. But Sasha knew it wasn't over. Back at her apartment, she dumped her laundry bag onto the floor, her hands trembling. Most of her clothes were there, but one thing was missing. Her favorite hoodie, the one her dad gave her before he passed. And in its place was a single, damp page torn from the book. On it, scrawled in wet ink, was one word, repeat. The next morning, Sasha walked by the laundromat. A for-lease sign hung crookedly in the window, and the building looked as though it had been abandoned for years. But when she pressed her ear to the glass, she could still hear the faint hum of the machines inside. And when she looked down, a damp sock lay by the door, waiting for her to pick it up. It began with an app notification. New match. Say hi. The ping jolted me out of my evening scroll through TikTok, and I almost ignored it. I'd only downloaded the dating app out of boredom, swiping absent-mindedly whenever Netflix wasn't holding my attention. Half the time, I didn't even bother responding to matches. But something about the username caught my eye. Just your type. It was cheesy, sure, but intriguing enough that I tapped on a profile. No picture, just a bio that read, "I'll make you laugh before I make you cry," winky face, and a single message, "You have great taste in people. Let's see if you're as interesting as you look." I rolled my eyes, but found myself typing back anyway. Something about the directness got under my skin like a challenge. Flattery will get you everywhere, I replied, smirking to myself. Within seconds, they responded, "You think that was flattery? Wait until you hear the real compliments." And just like that, we were talking. The conversation flowed so smoothly, it felt like I was chatting with someone I'd known for years. They asked thoughtful questions. What's the one book you wish you could read again for the first time? If you could steal one talent, what would it be? The kind of questions that made you want to linger in the answers. I found myself laughing, leaning into their humor, feeling oddly comfortable. Too comfortable. I didn't realize how much time had passed until my phone buzzed with a low battery warning. When I checked the clock, it was nearly 2 a.m. Okay, I need sleep, I wrote. You're a great distraction, but I have to function tomorrow. Good night then, they replied. Dream sweet. I'll see you soon. I figured it was just one of those quirky sign-offs people use to sound mysterious. But it stayed with me as I drifted off, a strange little echo in the back of my mind. The next day, I didn't have to wait long to hear from them. They messaged me first thing in the morning, light, funny, nothing out of the ordinary. We texted back and forth throughout the day, and for the next few days, they became part of my routine. Whenever I had a spare moment, they were there like a quiet hum in the background of my life. Then the weird stuff started. The first thing was small enough to shrug off. I mentioned I'd been craving Thai food, and an hour later, there was a knock at my door. A delivery driver stood there, holding a bag with my favorite order from a local spot I hadn't been to in months. I hadn't told them my address. When I asked if they'd sent it, they replied with a winking emoji and wrote, "Lucky guess." It should have been creepy, but instead I was flattered, maybe even a little charmed. I convinced myself it was harmless, a quirky gesture from someone trying to impress me. People Google each other all the time, right? The next incident was harder to explain away. I told them I was heading to the park to read, and when I arrived, A paperback was lying on the bench I always sat on. The title? The exact book I'd mentioned wanting to reread during one of our late-night chats. Inside the cover, there was no note, no inscription, just a single post-it with my name written in bold, looping letters. I didn't know what to think. When I messaged them about it, they played coy. "Maybe you just have a secret admirer," they wrote. "That is weird," my roommate said when I told her. "But maybe they're just going all out? I mean, some people are really into romantic gestures." Romantic. That's what I try to call it too. Until the night I spotted them. I was walking home late, earbuds in, when I felt the weight of someone's gaze. You know, that instinct, the way your body knows you're being watched before your brain does? I turned and saw someone standing under a street lamp half a block behind me. They weren't moving, just standing there, silhouetted by the light. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then they shifted, taking a step forward, and I felt my pulse spike. I couldn't make out their face, but something about their posture felt familiar. Like I'd seen it before. My stomach churned as a thought slid into place. Just your type. I didn't stick around to find out. I hurried home, locking the door behind me, my heart racing. When I checked my phone, there was a new message waiting for me. "You looked even better in person. Wish I'd said hi." I didn't respond. I didn't even open the app. Instead, I deleted it entirely, telling myself it was over, that whoever they were, they'd move on. But deleting the app didn't stop the messages. They started texting me directly, using a number I didn't recognize. "Why'd you leave? I thought we had something good." I blocked the number, but they found other ways. Emails, voicemails. Once, I woke up to a note slipped under my door. "You're not easy to forget." I went to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The messages were unsettling, sure, but nothing overtly threatening. When I mentioned the food delivery and the book, they shrugged. "Sounds like someone with too much time on their hands," one officer said. "Just keep your doors locked." I tried to move on. I stopped going to the park, changed my walking routes, even started staying with friends when I felt too uneasy to be alone. Weeks passed without incident, and I let myself believe it was over. Then last night I heard a knock at my window. I live on the 3rd floor. When I pulled back the curtain, there was no one there, just a single, pale fingerprint smudged on the glass. My phone buzzed into silence. A new message. "I'll always find you. You're just my type. I haven't slept since." And the worst part? They were right. It started as flattery, and now I'm here playing their game, too scared to figure out how it ends. The first thing I noticed about the house was the doorbell. It didn't chime like a normal doorbell. It played a melody, a strange, lilting tune that was just slightly off-key. I didn't recognize it, but it stuck in my head like a splinter. By the time the realtor unlocked the door, I was already humming it under my breath. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place you'd forget the moment you drove past it. The walls were beige, the carpets were clean but dated, and the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and dust. It wasn't perfect, but I didn't need perfect. I just needed affordable. The realtor seemed eager to close the deal. "It's been on the market for a while," she said, her smile a little too bright. "A hidden gem, really. You're lucky no one snatched it up yet." I didn't think much of the way she avoided looking at the doorbell. I moved in 2 weeks later. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked, arranged my furniture, and started settling into a new routine. Every night, I fell asleep to the comforting hum of the neighborhood. Distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of a dog. But on the 4th night, the doorbell rang. I checked the time, 2:13 a.m. It was the melody, the same strange tune I'd heard the first day. It played once, slowly and deliberately, and then fell silent. I waited, heart pounding, but no one knocked. When I finally worked up the courage to peek through the peephole, the porch was empty. I told myself it was a prank. Kids, maybe, or a wiring issue. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The doorbell rang again the next night. Same time, same melody. This time, I was ready. I grabbed a flashlight and yanked open the door, expecting to catch someone running away. But there was no one there, just the empty street and the soft rustle of the wind. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight across the lawn, the bushes, the driveway. Nothing. As I turned back toward the house, something caught my eye. The doorbell was glowing. It was faint, barely noticeable, but the button emitted a soft, pale light. I reached out to touch it, and the glow faded instantly. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the end of the week, the doorbell was ringing every night. Always at 2:13 a.m., always the same melody. I stopped going to the door. There was never anyone there. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the clock, waiting for it to happen. I tried to disconnect it, but the wiring didn't make sense. The doorbell wasn't connected to the wall in any way I could understand. There were no wires, no batteries, no visible source of power. I even tried replacing it. I bought a new doorbell from the hardware store and installed it myself, carefully removing the old one. But that night, at 2:13 a.m., the melody played again. The new doorbell was gone, replaced by the original. The next morning, I called an electrician. The man arrived with a cheerful attitude and a toolbox full of gadgets. He inspected the doorbell, tested the wiring, and frowned. "This thing's ancient," he said, scratching his head. "But it's not connected to anything. It shouldn't even work." I didn't tell him about the nightly melody. I just nodded and thanked him, hoping his confusion was enough to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. That night, the doorbell didn't ring. Instead, I heard footsteps. They started softly just outside my bedroom window. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching against the gravel path that ran alongside the house. I froze, straining to listen. The steps moved around the house, circling, pausing occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was out there was deciding where to go next. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but the silence stretched on. Finally, I climbed out of bed and tiptoed to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. When I pulled back the curtain, the yard was empty, but the doorbell was glowing again. The melody played, soft and slow, as I stood there, staring at the front door. This time, it didn't stop. It looped, repeating over and over, each note burrowing deeper into my skull. I didn't answer the door. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing my deposit. I just needed to get out. I threw my things into a suitcase, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. But the door wouldn't open. The locks turned, the handle moved, but the door refused to budge. I tried the windows, the back door, even the garage, but every exit was the same. Stuck. I pounded on the front door, screaming for help, but no one came. Then the doorbell rang. I turned slowly and saw it glowing brighter than ever before. The melody was faster now, more insistent. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and pressed the button. The music stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door opened. Not to the outside, not to my yard or the street or anything I recognized. It opened to darkness. Deep, endless darkness, stretching out in every direction. And from that darkness came a sound. Footsteps. They were slow at first, distant and echoing, but they grew louder. Closer. Something was coming. I slammed the door and backed away, my hands shaking. The footsteps stopped just on the other side, and I could feel it there. Something waiting, watching. The doorbell hasn't rung since. Now it's just quiet. Too quiet. I don't try to leave anymore. I know the door won't open. Not to anything I want to see. Sometimes, though, I catch myself humming the melody. And sometimes, I hear it again, faint and far away, like it's calling me. I think one day I'll answer. When the letter came, I almost threw it out. It was hand-addressed, but I didn't recognize the sender. Department of Relocation, Edensfield Archives. No return address. The paper felt strange, thicker than normal, like it had been hand-pressed. I wasn't expecting any correspondence, and frankly, it looked like one of those fake official mailers trying to sell me something. But something about the name Edensfield gave me pause. Edensfield was my hometown, or what was left of it. I hadn't been back in years. Most of it had been abandoned after a chemical spill at the factory just outside of town. They called it uninhabitable on the news, and a lot of people, my family included, were relocated. It wasn't a place people talked about anymore. When I looked it up a few years back, I found barely any information. Just vague articles and a single grainy photo of a chain-link fence surrounding overgrown streets. The idea that someone was sending me mail from there felt impossible. I opened the envelope carefully, half expecting junk. Instead, I found a typed note, brief and oddly formal. The item you requested has been recovered. Please proceed to the archives to retrieve your property. There was no mention of what the item was. The letter was signed Dr. M. Greaves and included an address, back in Edensfield. I stared at it for a long time, trying to piece together some kind of logic. I hadn't requested anything, and certainly not from Edensfield. What item could they possibly have for me? Most of my family's things had been left behind during the relocation, but none of it was worth recovering, much less delivering a cryptic letter about it years later. Still, I couldn't shake the curiosity. There was a strange pull to the idea of going back. Maybe it was the lack of closure, or just some morbid curiosity to see what had become of the place. Either way, I took the letter and shoved it into my bag. By the weekend, I was on the road. Edensfield looked worse than I imagined. The highway exit had been blocked off with orange barrels and faded "Do Not Enter" signs, but they were easy enough to maneuver around. The town itself was overgrown, the roads cracked and swallowed by weeds. Houses slouched under collapsing roofs, their windows yawning like open mouths. The address led me to what used to be the municipal building. It was one of the few structures still standing, though time hadn't been kind. The doors were boarded up, but someone had pried one loose, leaving enough space to squeeze through. Inside, it smelled like mildew and rust. I called out, expecting nothing, but my voice echoed down the empty halls. The letter crinkled in my pocket as I followed the signs marked archives, the only clue in this labyrinth of decay. They led me to a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. I hesitated before pushing it open. The room inside was pristine. Unlike the rest of the building, it was spotless, with walls painted a sterile white and shelves filled with neatly labeled boxes. A single desk stood in the center, and behind it sat a man wearing a pressed lab coat. He looked up when I entered, his expression neutral, as if he'd been expecting me. "Name?" he asked. Aaron Walker," I said, still trying to process the bizarre shift in atmosphere. He nodded, flipping through a clipboard. After a moment, he said, "Yes. One item. I'll retrieve it." Before I could respond, he disappeared through a door at the back of the room. I stood there, awkward and unsure, glancing at the boxes on the shelves. They weren't marked with numbers or dates, just names. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each written in neat, black script. When the man returned, he was holding a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. He placed it on the desk in front of me without ceremony. "This is yours," he said. I stared at it. The box was unremarkable, smooth wood with no markings, no lock. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he slid the box closer and gestured for me to open it. I hesitated, but finally lifted the lid. Inside was a single object, an old cassette tape. No label, no markings, just a blank black shell. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. "I don't understand," I said. "What is this supposed to be? I didn't ask for this." The man's expression didn't change. "It belongs to you. That's all I know." I started to protest, to ask for more details, but something about his tone made me stop. He looked tired, like he'd answered the same questions too many times. I left without saying another word. Back in my car, I stared at the tape. I didn't have a cassette player, and it wasn't like there was a Walmart nearby to pick one up. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt like the tape was waiting. Eventually, I drove back to my apartment. I borrowed an old tape recorder from a friend who asked too many questions I couldn't answer. That night, I sat on my couch, the recorder in front of me, and finally pressed play. At first, there was nothing, just static. I frowned, wondering if the tape was blank. But then, faintly, I heard it, a voice. It was my voice. I froze, the sound of my own voice sending chills down my spine. But it wasn't me speaking. Not now. It was younger. My voice as a child. "Mom? Dad?" the voice said. It sounded scared, almost panicked. I leaned closer, my heart hammering. I didn't remember ever recording myself as a kid, let alone saying something like that. "Where are you?" "It's dark," the voice continued. Then there was a pause, followed by a whisper. "I think something's in here with me." The static returned, louder now, hissing and crackling like a storm. My hands shook as I hit stop. I stared at the recorder, my mind racing. The voice on the tape, it wasn't just similar to mine. It was mine, exactly as I remembered it from when I was 8 or 9. I played the tape again, but the recording had changed. This time, there were no words, just faint breathing and the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. I don't remember much of that night. I know I didn't sleep. I know I tried to call the number on the letter, but it didn't connect. The next morning, the tape was gone. The recorder was there, but the tape wasn't. Sometimes I still hear it though. Not the tape itself, but the voice, my voice. It whispers from dark corners, from behind closed doors. And every time it's asking the same question. Where are you? 3 minutes. I always set it to 3 minutes to heat my dinner, and I always hit start right away. But one night, when I turned around to grab a fork, the timer was counting down from 2:47. I froze. The button must have stuck, I told myself. Maybe I hit start without realizing. The simplest explanations are usually the best, right? But when it happened again the next day, this time skipping to 2:35, I started to feel uneasy. Over the next week, little things began to feel off. My laptop battery drained at odd speeds. 45% 1 minute, then 78% the next. My clock skipped ahead 3 minutes while I was brushing my teeth. A podcast I'd been listening to jumped to the middle of an episode one hadn't started yet. It wasn't just the tech, though. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and feel like I'd already been there, like I'd just stepped out for a second and forgotten. The air would have this strange, charged stillness, as though I was interrupting something. It wasn't enough to make me feel scared. Not yet, but the pattern nagged at me. Then I noticed the photographs. One evening, as I scrolled through the photos on my phone, I found a picture I didn't recognize. It was on my kitchen table, a perfect overhead shot. My mug, my notebook, the salt shaker, all arranged exactly as they had been when I sat down for breakfast that morning. Except I didn't take the photo. I must have accidentally hit the button, I thought. My brain has a knack for finding explanations, even when the explanations don't quite stick. But after that, the photos kept appearing. My reflection in the bathroom mirror, but taken from the angle of the doorway. My silhouette against the window, snapped in the middle of the night. One of me sitting on the couch, looking directly at the camera. I deleted them all. The day after that, I found a voice memo on my phone titled "Listen." My first instinct was to delete it, but something about the way it was just sitting there, waiting, made me press play. The recording was about 30 seconds of static. Just as I was about to stop it, I heard my own voice, faint and distorted, like it had been recorded through a wall. "It's not safe," I said. "Get out." My blood ran cold. I stayed home from work the next day, convinced that someone was messing with me, an ex, a bored neighbor, maybe even a hacker. I locked every door, every window, even blocked the peephole with duct tape. But the house didn't feel any safer. The air had that charged stillness again, heavy and oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I tried to distract myself, but nothing felt real. My books looked wrong, like the spines were arranged in a sequence I couldn't decipher. My furniture was familiar, but alien, as though someone had recreated it from memory and gotten the details just slightly off. When I walked past the mirror, my reflection lingered a beat too long before following my movement. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was coming from the hallway outside my apartment. Then I realized the sound was inside. It wasn't loud, just soft, deliberate steps moving from room to room. I stayed frozen in bed, my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My bedroom door was slightly open, and I could see a sliver of the hallway. The steps stopped right in front of the door. I don't know what possessed me, but I whispered, "Who's there?" The door creaked open, just a few inches more, and for a second I thought I saw something in the shadows. A shape that was almost human, but wrong. Its edges shimmered like heat waves. And its face, if it even had a face, shifted too quickly for me to make sense of it. And then it was gone. The next morning, I packed a bag and checked into a motel. I didn't know where I was going or what I was running from, but I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment. But it followed me. The microwave in my motel room started skipping seconds. My phone played a recording of my own voice saying, "You can't leave." The charged stillness was there, too, hanging heavy in the air, like whatever this was had seeped into my life and rooted itself too deeply to be escaped. And now, the photos are worse. They show places I haven't been yet. A gas station I passed an hour ago, a diner I was thinking about stopping at, a highway rest stop that looks suspiciously like the one I'm parked in now. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if I'm slipping out of reality or if something else is stepping into mine. All I know is whatever it is, it's getting closer. Just now, I found a new photo on my phone. It's of me sitting in my car. In the background, through the driver's side window, there's a face pressed against the glass. It's mine, but it's smiling. I didn't notice the car at first. It was a nondescript blue sedan, the kind you'd pass on any street without a second glance. But now, I can remember the exact moment it appeared. I was walking home from the bus stop, headphones in, replaying an awkward conversation with my boss in my head. The streetlights had just flickered on, and the air smelled faintly of rain. The sedan was parked across the street, engine idling. I only noticed because its headlights flared briefly as I stepped off the curb. I glanced at it, just a reflex, and then forgot about it entirely. Until the next night. I was on the same route, heading home from work, when I saw it again. The same car, same spot. This time, its headlights clicked off as I passed. I slowed, staring at it for a moment, but there was nothing outwardly strange about it. No bumper stickers, no scratches or dents. Just a car. The next few days, I didn't think much of it. Work was chaotic, and my mind was too preoccupied to dwell on coincidences. But when Friday rolled around, there was again same car, same spot. This time, the driver's side window was down slightly, just enough for me to catch a glint of someone's silhouette in the driver's seat. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the car belonged to a neighbor. Maybe someone just had an unusual schedule. But something about it unnerved me, and I started walking faster. That weekend, I convinced myself it was nothing. By Monday, I'd nearly forgotten the whole thing until the car started moving. I just stepped off the bus, fumbling with my bag, when I noticed the sedan pulling out of its usual spot. It followed slowly, its engine low and smooth. I told myself it wasn't following me, not really. It was just going the same way. But when I crossed the street abruptly, it mirrored the move. My heart started to race. The streetlights were spaced far apart, leaving long stretches of shadow between them. The car kept its distance, gliding through the pools of light and disappearing into the dark stretches. I felt like prey, my every step accompanied by the soft hum of its engine. I turned a corner, then another, taking the long way home to see if it would follow. It did. By the time I reached my building, my chest felt tight and my hands were clammy. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, and peered out the window. The sedan had stopped down the street, its headlights off. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I decided to switch things up. Instead of taking the bus, I carpooled with a coworker. When I got home, I looked up and down the street. No blue sedan. Relief washed over me, and I started to feel silly for how worked up I'd gotten. But later that night, when I went to throw out the trash, it was there again, parked across the street. The same faint silhouette sat in the driver's seat, utterly still. I stood frozen in my driveway, gripping the trash bag, unable to tear my eyes away. And then the figure moved, a subtle tilt of the head, as if they were looking directly at me. I dropped the trash and ran inside, bolting the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with my phone to call the police. When they arrived, the car was gone. They took my statement, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. Probably someone waiting to pick up a friend, one of them said. But it wasn't just someone. I was sure of it. Over the next week, the car became a constant presence. It wasn't always parked across the street. Sometimes I'd spot it a block over or further down the road, but it was always there, just far enough to make me doubt myself. When I went to the grocery store, it appeared in the parking lot. When I stopped by a cafe, I caught it cruising past the window. I started changing my routines, walking different routes, leaving at different times, but it didn't matter. The sedan was always one step ahead. I stopped sleeping, jumping at every shadow or faint sound outside my window. Then last night something changed. I was sitting in my apartment, curtains drawn, when I heard it, the low hum of an engine idling outside. My stomach dropped. I crept to the window and peeked through a tiny gap in the curtains. The blue sedan was parked directly outside my building. Its headlights were off, but the engine was running. For the first time, the driver got out. It was a man dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. He moved slowly, deliberately, crossing the street toward my building. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced. Should I call the police again? Run? Before I could decide, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Nice place you've got. Mind if I come in? Panic surged through me. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. Another text came through. You really shouldn't have ignored me. I'm coming up. I looked toward the door, half expecting it to burst open. But instead, I heard something else, a soft knock at the window. Slowly, I turned my head. There he was, standing just outside the glass, his face obscured by the shadow of his hoodie. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me, unblinking. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I locked myself in the bathroom and called 911. By the time the police arrived, the man and the car were gone. They're investigating, but there's not much they can do without a license plate or a clear description. I'm staying with a friend now, but I can't shake the feeling that he'll find me again. Every time I hear a car engine, my stomach twists. Every time I see a blue sedan, my chest tightens. And last night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I got another text. I see you. I stopped in on my way home to grab some snacks. One of those impulsive decisions you make when you know you'll regret it later. The guy behind the counter was the usual cashier, a middle-aged man with a graying beard and tired eyes. I'd seen him dozens of times before, always polite but unremarkable, like the background character of a movie you barely notice. But that night, as I approached the counter with a bag of chips and a soda, he looked up at me with a sharp intensity that made me stop in my tracks. His eyes were wide, like he was startled or scared. He leaned forward slightly and said, "You've already been here." I blinked. "What? You were here earlier," he said, his voice low and firm. "You bought the same things. You paid with exact change." I laughed nervously, certain he was mistaken. That wasn't me. I just got off work. His brow furrowed, and he leaned back, looking me up and down like he was trying to figure something out. "Must have been someone who looked like you," he muttered, though his tone didn't match his words. I left the store feeling uneasy, replaying the exchange in my head. I knew it wasn't me. I hadn't been to the store in days. But the way he'd said it, so certain, so unervingly precise, it stuck with me. When I got home, my roommate Tara was on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Hey," I said, kicking off my shoes. She didn't respond. "Earth to Tara," I said, louder this time, and waved a hand in front of her face. She glanced up at me, her expression blank for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. "Oh, hey, you're back." "Back from what?" "You just left," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the door. "No, I didn't." She frowned. Yeah, you did. You grabbed your keys, said you'd be back in 10, and walked out. That was like 2 minutes ago." I stared at her, trying to gauge whether she was messing with me. But Tara wasn't the type to pull elaborate pranks. She barely had the energy to do her laundry, let alone concoct something like this. "I just got home," I said slowly. Her smile faltered. "You're kidding, right? I literally saw you." We stared at each other for a long moment, the room unnervingly silent except for the faint buzz of the fridge. Finally, she shrugged and went back to her phone, muttering something about needing more sleep. I retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I woke up to an unfamiliar sound. It was faint, like distant footsteps, but they weren't coming from outside. They were inside in my apartment. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 6:47 a.m. Too early for Tara to be up. I opened the door cautiously, peering into the hallway. The apartment was still, the light pale and cold through the windows. Tara's door was closed. I stepped into the kitchen and my stomach dropped. The snacks I'd bought from the corner store were on the counter, opened and partially eaten. I hadn't touched them. I stood frozen, the air in the room thick with something I couldn't quite name. Then, from behind me, I heard my own voice say, "Good morning." I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but the kitchen was empty. My phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. That day, I tried to tell myself it was just stress, overwork, lack of sleep, some kind of waking dream. But no amount of logic could explain the mounting strangeness. Tara acted like everything was normal, but I caught her staring at me a little too long, like she was waiting for me to do something. The second incident happened 3 days later. I was walking to the subway when I saw someone ahead of me wearing a jacket identical to mine. It was a small detail, but something about it made me speed up, wanting to see their face. When I got closer, I froze. They weren't just wearing the same jacket. They were wearing the same outfit. My favorite jeans, my scuffed sneakers, the exact shade of gray hoodie I'd bought 2 years ago. And when they turned slightly, I saw their profile. It was me. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. The other me didn't notice, or pretended not to. They kept walking, their stride casual, disappearing into the crowd. I didn't go to work that day. Over the next week, things escalated. Objects in my apartment started appearing in strange places. My toothbrush in the freezer, my shoes neatly lined up on the windowsill. Tara grew distant, barely acknowledging me when I spoke. And I kept seeing myself. On the street, in shop windows, in reflections that didn't match my movements. I tried to talk to Tara about it once. "Do you ever feel like something's off?" I asked, my voice shaking. She looked up from her phone, her expression unreadable. "You mean like deja vu?" "No," I said. Like something's wrong with reality. Like we're in a dream, or a glitch, or..." She laughed, cutting me off. It wasn't her usual laugh. It was hollow, mechanical, like the sound of an engine sputtering to life. "You're imagining things," she said, but the way she said it wasn't comforting. It was a warning. That night, I stayed awake, determined to catch whatever, or whoever, was messing with me. Around 3 a.m., I heard movement in the living room. I crept out of bed, clutching my phone as a makeshift weapon, and peeked around the corner. Tara was sitting on the couch, staring straight ahead. She didn't blink, didn't move, just sat there like a mannequin. And then, without turning her head, she said, "You shouldn't be here." "I live here," I said, my voice trembling. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "Not anymore." That's when I noticed a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was me again. This version of me smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't reach their eyes. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, the apartment was empty. Tara was gone. The snacks were gone. Even the strange little details, like the misplaced toothbrush, had vanished. It was like none of it had ever happened. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Dozens of versions of me, scattered through the crowd, all staring back at me with that same unsettling smile. And now, every time I see my reflection, I wonder, am I still the original? Or am I just another copy? It started when I moved into the new apartment. I was newly single, freshly promoted, and determined to make my life feel like it was on an upswing. The apartment was perfect. 3rd floor, lots of sunlight, a balcony overlooking a quiet park. It felt like the kind of place where you could start over. The only thing I didn't like was the hallway. It was narrow and dimly lit, with walls painted a washed-out beige that seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. The carpet was old and patterned with a swirl design that gave me vertigo if I stared at it too long. But it wasn't a deal breaker. I figured I'd get used to it. The first night I moved in, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, passing my door and fading into the distance. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a neighbor coming home late. But when I stepped out the next morning, I noticed something strange. There was a wet footprint just outside my door. It wasn't a shoe print, though. It was a bare foot. The toes splayed as if whoever it belonged to had been pressing down hard. It looked fresh, the water still pooling in the grooves of the carpet. I glanced up and down the hall, but saw nothing. No other footprints, no damp trail leading to or from it. Just that single, solitary print. I chalked it up to a leaky pipe or an overactive imagination and went about my day. The second night, the footsteps came again. This time, they stopped right outside my door. I turned off the TV and held my breath, straining to hear anything else. The doorknob rattled just once like someone was testing it. My heart jumped into my throat. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but something stopped me. I just sat there, frozen, until the footsteps started up again and faded down the hall. In the morning, there were more footprints. Two this time, one just outside my door again, and another farther down the hall, both as wet and bare as the first. I started asking my neighbors about it. Most of them shrugged or gave me polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. One woman, Mrs. Gupta from 3B, just shook her head and muttered, "Best to keep your door locked at night." "Why?" I pressed. She hesitated, looking past me like she was making sure no one was listening. "It's probably nothing. Just don't let it in." That made no sense, but she wouldn't elaborate. I laughed it off with her, pretending I wasn't unnerved, and went back to my apartment. That night, I stayed up late, determined to catch whoever or whatever was leaving those footprints. I sat in the dark with the TV muted, a baseball bat resting against my knee, listening for the sound of footsteps. Sure enough, they came, slow and heavy, dragging along the carpet. They stopped right outside my door. This time, I moved. I crept up to the peephole, gripping the bat tightly, and peered out into the hallway. There was no one there. I could still hear the footsteps, clear as day, pacing back and forth in front of my door. But through the peephole, the hallway was empty. My pulse hammered in my ears. I thought about opening the door, confronting whatever it was, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the sound, the wet, dragging shuffle, made my skin crawl. I didn't want to know what was making it. The next morning, the footprints were back, more of them now. They crisscrossed the hallway, overlapping and circling, as if something had been pacing outside my door for hours. I felt sick just looking at them. Over the next few nights, the footsteps got louder, more insistent. The doorknob rattled more frequently, harder each time, like something was getting frustrated. I started sleeping with earplugs and a chair wedged under the doorknob, but it didn't help. I could still hear it, even with the earplugs in, those dragging steps, that faint, wet sound. Then one night, the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite. Just a light tap, tap, tap against the door. I ignored it, pulling the blanket over my head like a child hiding from a monster. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more forceful, until it was a relentless pounding that made the whole door shake. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I thought I'd imagined it at first. I pulled the blanket down, heart racing, and stared at the door. The apartment was silent again. Too silent. Even the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the building seemed to have disappeared. Then I heard it. A soft, wet plop. I turned slowly and saw it. A single, bare footprint on the floor of my living room, glistening in the dim light. Another appeared next to it, and then another, forming a trail that led straight toward my bedroom. I don't remember grabbing my keys or leaving the apartment. I just remember running, barefoot in panic, down the hallway and out into the night. I didn't stop until I was halfway across town, my breath hitching in my chest, my bare feet raw and bleeding from the pavement. I haven't been back since. The landlord called me last week, asking when I planned to pick up my things. I didn't know how to explain to her that I didn't want them anymore, that I didn't care about the deposit or the furniture, or even the photos of my family that I'd left behind. All I care about is that I don't hear those footsteps anymore. The first time I realized I was invisible, it was a Tuesday. Not metaphorically invisible. Not, oh, no one notices me at work, invisible, but actually invisible. The kind that screws with your reflection in a mirror and makes people walk straight through you like you're mist. I didn't plan for it. I didn't do anything special. I just woke up, brushed my teeth, and noticed I didn't have a shadow anymore. I stared at the empty spot on the bathroom wall where my shadow used to cling. It wasn't the most comforting start to a morning, but I told myself it was some weird trick of the light. I checked my pulse, still there. Heartbeat solid. Breath? Fog up the mirror just fine. I was alive, but the visual confirmation of my existence was optional. By the time I left my apartment, I convinced myself it wasn't worth panicking over. That lasted until I got on the subway. Packed car, standing room only, and not a single person noticed me. Not the guy scrolling through his phone, not the woman reading her book, not the kid kicking his legs in a stroller. I squeezed between two commuters to grab a pole, and my hand passed right through it. That was harder to ignore. I stepped back, instinctively apologizing, and the commuters didn't even flinch. I waved my hand in front of the woman's face. Nothing. She turned the page in her book, oblivious. Now, I like to tell you I freaked out, but honestly, I was more curious than scared. Who doesn't fantasize about disappearing? It's a get-out-of-jail-free card for all the awkward stuff in life. But there's a big difference between fantasizing about it and waking up one morning to find out that, yes, you've officially entered the Twilight Zone. The rest of the day was like living in an alternate reality. I walked into a coffee shop, stared at the pastries, and wondered if I could still eat. Turns out you can. I ordered a latte out of habit, and while the barista ignored me, the cup appeared on the counter. When I picked it up, her eyes darted to the empty air where my hand should have been, her face twisting in confusion. "Did someone pay for this?" she asked no one in particular. I left a 5 on the counter because I'm not a monster and walked out. She kept staring at the door long after it closed. Things got weirder from there. You don't think about the little ways people react to you in public. Eye contact, sidestepping to let you pass, saying excuse me when they bump into you. Without those things, the world feels untethered, like you're watching a movie instead of living in it. Cars didn't stop when I crossed the street. The clerk at the grocery store scanned my items without asking if I wanted a bag. A dog barked at the empty sidewalk where I stood, its owner yanking the leash, muttering about how dogs always bark at nothing. That night, I sat in my apartment and stared at the ceiling. I wasn't lonely, exactly. I'd lived alone for years, but the silence was different now. The city outside my window buzzed with the usual hum of life, but it felt distant, unreachable. I checked my phone. No texts, no calls. Of course not. I could have texted someone, I guess, but what would I say? "Hey, FYI, I'm a ghost now. Want to grab drinks?" On Wednesday, I decided to test the limits. If I could walk through poles, what else could I do? Turns out a lot. I walked into a bank vault. The guard yawned as I strolled past, his gaze fixed on the security monitors. Inside, stacks of cash sat neatly arranged in rows, pristine and untouched. I reached out to grab a bundle, and my hand passed right through it. So, okay, maybe I couldn't be rich. Good to know. By Thursday, I was restless. You'd think being invisible would open up endless opportunities, sneaking into concerts, eavesdropping on secrets, living without rules. And it did, but the novelty wore off fast. It's hard to enjoy something when no one else knows you're there to see it. I sat on a park bench, watching people walk by. A kid chased a pigeon. A couple argued quietly, their hands gesturing in sharp, jerky motions. An old man fed breadcrumbs to the ducks, his expression calm and patient, like he had all the time in the world. None of them saw me. None of them knew I existed. And then she did. She was young, maybe 25, with messy hair and a coat 2 sizes too big. She walked past my bench, paused, and turned her head. Her eyes locked onto mine. "You," she said, pointing. I blinked. "Me?" She nodded, walking closer. "You're one of them, aren't you?" "One of who?" "The in-betweens." She sat down beside me, as casually as if I were just another park regular. "The ones who slip through the cracks." I stared at her, my mind spinning. "You can see me?" She smirked. "Obviously. Took me a while to find you, though. You're quieter than the others." "Others?" She tilted her head, studying me like a scientist examining a lab rat. "Oh, you don't know? That's cute. You think you're the only one." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. "What are you talking about?" "There are hundreds of you," she said, her tone breezy. "Maybe thousands. People who fall off the map. Nobody knows why. One day, you're living your normal life. The next, poof. You're a ghost. Kind of. Anyway. But I'm not dead," I said. She shrugged. "Sure. You're not alive either, though, are you?" I wanted to argue, but the words caught in my throat. She was right. I wasn't alive. Not in the way I used to be. "So what happens now?" I asked. "That's up to you," she said, standing. "Most people drift. Fade out completely, eventually. But some of us? We stick around. Why? Because someone has to help the others figure it out." She smiled, sharp and bright. "You'll get there. When you're ready." And just like that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I sat on the bench for a long time, the city blurring around me. By Friday, I'd stopped trying to find my reflection. Instead, I started leaving breadcrumbs for the ones who came after me. Because if I wasn't going to fade away, I might as well make it worth staying. It started with the smell of lemons. Not fresh lemons like you'd get at the grocery store, but something sharp, chemical, artificial. I noticed it as I walked into my apartment one evening after work. It wasn't unpleasant, exactly, just out of place. I don't use lemon-scented cleaners, and my windows have been closed all day. The scent lingered faintly, following me as I moved from room to room. By the time I'd changed into sweatpants, it was gone. I chalked it up to nothing, a weird smell from the hallway, maybe. The next day it happened again. This time it wasn't just the smell. My fridge was humming. It always hummed, but this was louder, deeper, almost rhythmic. It pulsed through the kitchen like a heartbeat. I stood in front of it, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound stopped the second I opened the door. Everything inside was as it should be: milk, eggs, leftover pizza. But when I closed the fridge, I saw it, a single lemon sitting on the counter. I didn't own any lemons. I stared at it for a while, feeling vaguely ridiculous. It was just a lemon. What was I supposed to do? Call the cops? I laughed at myself and tossed it in the trash. But when I turned back to the counter, there was another one. I didn't sleep well that night. Over the next few days, more small, strange things happened. My phone started glitching, the screen flickering to static for a split second before going back to normal. My kitchen faucet dripped even when I turned the handle as tight as it would go, and when I left the apartment, my neighbor's cat hissed at me every time I passed. The lemon smell never went away. It hovered at the edge of everything, subtle but insistent, like a song stuck in my head. Then I started losing time. I'd glance at the clock, and an hour would vanish without me noticing. I'd find myself in rooms I didn't remember entering, holding objects I didn't remember picking up. Once, I woke up sitting at my desk, the word citron scribbled over and over on a notepad in handwriting that didn't look like mine. I Googled it. Citron, French for lemon. That was all. The first time I saw the figure was late at night. I'd gotten up for a glass of water. The apartment bathed in the faint orange glow of the streetlights outside. As I walked into the kitchen, I froze. Someone was standing in the corner, just at the edge of the light. A man, or something shaped like a man. His body was dark, but his outline shimmered faintly, like heat rising off asphalt. I couldn't see his face. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if observing me. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. The glass I'd been holding shattered on the floor. The next day, I found lemons everywhere. Dozens of them. In the sink, on the couch, in my shoes. They weren't there when I woke up, but by the time I finished brushing my teeth, they had invaded every corner of my apartment. The smell was overwhelming now, sharp and cloying, making my eyes water. I tried throwing them away, bagging them up, hauling them to the dumpster outside, but it didn't matter. Every time I turned around, more would appear. That night, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and sat in the middle of my living room, surrounded by the damned lemons. If something was going to happen, I'd face it head on. The apartment was eerily silent, the hum of the fridge gone, the traffic outside muffled. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just me and the lemons. Then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., my TV turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, the sound crackling like a live wire. I stood, gripping the knife tighter, and moved toward it. As I got closer, the static began to form shapes, blurry at first, then sharper, more defined. It was the figure. He was staring directly at me through the screen, his head still tilted, the shimmering outline of his body pulsing faintly. He raised a hand, and though the screen had no sound beyond static, I swear I heard him whisper, "Why did you forget?" I staggered back, the knife slipping from my hand. "What do you mean?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The static flickered, and for a moment I saw something else, images flashing too fast to make sense of. A tree heavy with lemons. A yellow sky. People laughing, their faces blurred. A hand reaching out toward mine. Then, the screen went black. and the apartment plunged into silence. When I turned back, the lemons were gone. Every single one. I thought that was the end of it. For a few days, things returned to normal. The smell faded, the glitches stopped, and the figure didn't return. But something wasn't right. My memories felt thin, like they were being held together by threads that could snap at any moment. I'd find myself staring at photographs of friends and family, unable to remember the exact context of when they were taken. Conversations felt stilted, like I was reading from a script I didn't write. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I'd see a faint shimmer, just for a second, before it disappeared. The final straw came when I found the tree. I'd gone for a walk to clear my head, hoping fresh air would help me shake the growing unease. But as I turned a corner, I found myself standing in a field I didn't recognize. In the center of the field was a tree, its branches laden with bright yellow lemons that seemed to glow faintly in the fading light. I didn't want to approach it, but my legs moved on their own. As I got closer, I noticed something carved into the trunk. Words etched deep into the bark. "You cannot go back." Behind me, the air shimmered, and I knew he was there, waiting. I hadn't planned to be at the cemetery that evening, but sometimes life has a way of nudging you toward places you'd rather avoid. It was the kind of dreary autumn day that makes everything look gray and tired, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. My mom had asked me to drop off flowers for my grandmother's grave, a task she usually handled herself. "Just this once," she'd said over the phone. I didn't argue. It felt too petty to say no. By the time I arrived, the place was nearly deserted. The air was thick with that damp smell of wet leaves and earth, and the only sounds were the rustle of branches and the occasional caw of a distant crow. I parked near the main path and carried the bouquet down the gravel walkway, my footsteps crunching in a steady rhythm. My grandmother's grave was near the back, in an older section of the cemetery where the stones leaned at odd angles, weathered by decades of rain and wind. I'd been here dozens of times, but it always felt unfamiliar, like the layout of the grave shifted when no one was looking. As I approached the grave, I noticed something odd. A man was standing a few rows away, staring intently at a headstone. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat that seemed too light for the weather. His head was tilted downward, hands clasped behind his back. I thought about ignoring him, but there was something about the way he stood, too still, too deliberate, that unsettled me. "Evening," I said, more to fill the silence than anything else. He didn't respond, didn't even look up, just stood there, as if the grave held some secret only he could hear. I set the flowers down and adjusted the vase, trying not to let my unease show. The man's presence gnawed at me, but I told myself it was nothing. People grieve in strange ways. Still, as I walked back toward my car, I couldn't resist glancing over my shoulder. He was gone. The headstone he'd been staring at was empty, the grass around it undisturbed. It was as if he'd never been there at all. I should have left then, driven home, shaken it off, and told myself I was imagining things. But something made me stop. Curiosity, maybe? Or stupidity. I turned back, my footsteps slower now, my heart beating just a little faster. The headstone was unremarkable, just a simple slab of granite with a name and 2 dates. But it wasn't the grave itself that caught my attention. It was the air around it, a kind of stillness that felt unnatural, as if the world was holding its breath. And then I saw it, a handprint, faint but undeniable, pressed into the damp earth beside the stone. The fingers were long and thin, the print too deep to have been made by someone casually leaning down. The rain started then, a soft drizzle that quickly turned into a steady downpour. I stood there, staring at the handprint, my brain struggling to make sense of it. Looking for someone? The voice came from behind me, low and calm. I spun around, my heart lurching into my throat. It was him, the man in the dark coat. Only now he was closer. Too close. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his lips curving into a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's just unusual to see someone here so late." "I was just leaving," I said quickly, taking a step back. He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of puzzle. "You noticed the handprint, didn't you?" I froze. What do you mean? His smile widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something not human. They like to leave their mark, little reminders that they're still around. I didn't know how to respond. My mouth felt dry, my legs rooted to the ground. You should go, he said, his voice soft but insistent. Before they notice you. Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain-soaked rows of headstones. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran back to my car, my shoes slipping on the wet gravel. By the time I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The rain pounded against the windshield as I started the engine and pulled out onto the empty road. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him, or something, following me. But the road stayed empty, the cemetery shrinking behind me until it was just a dark blur. When I got home, I went straight to my room and shut the door, trying to convince myself that I'd let my imagination run wild. But as I peeled off my wet jacket, something fell from the pocket. A small, folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. The words were written in a spidery script, the ink smudged but still legible. Some marks are permanent. Be careful where you tread. I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't been back to the cemetery since. But sometimes when I'm alone, I feel it. That same unnatural stillness, like the world is holding its breath. And I can't help but wonder if the marks I left that day are still there, or if something else has taken their place. The first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, half asleep. The air had that heavy, static-laden quality, like right before a thunderstorm. It felt wrong. Too quiet, too dense, like the room was holding its breath. I shifted uncomfortably and glanced toward the window. That's when I saw the clock on my nightstand. It wasn't moving. The second hand ticked to 3 and stopped. My phone on the dresser blinked, its screen frozen mid-notification. The light filtering through the curtains held still, as if time itself had ground to a halt. Then the hum started. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the buzz of electricity in an old wire. But it grew louder, deeper, until it resonated in my chest, vibrating every nerve. The air shimmered, rippling like heat haze, and the shadows in the room bent, tilted, like they were being drawn towards something just out of view. I sat up, heart pounding, and that's when I noticed it, a door on the wall opposite my bed. There wasn't supposed to be a door there. It was a simple thing, plain, wooden, with a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the dim light. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. I rubbed my eyes, pinched my arm, but the door stayed. The hum intensified, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward it, like a thread winding tight around my chest. I should have stayed in bed. I should have turned on the light, screamed, anything. But instead, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood. The carpet felt cold and damp under my feet. When I reached for the door, my hand hesitated just an inch away from the knob, trembling. The hum stopped. Silence rushed in, deafening, like all sound had been sucked out of the world. I opened the door. The room beyond wasn't a room. It was a vast, endless space filled with pale, flickering light. The floor beneath my feet was smooth, reflective like glass. I couldn't see walls or a ceiling, just a horizon that stretched into infinity. The air was colder here, thin, like I was standing at the top of a mountain. And then I saw them, figures scattered across the expanse, moving in slow, deliberate patterns. They didn't have faces, just smooth, blank ovals where features should have been. Their bodies were human in shape, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and fragmented like old film frames skipping. I don't know why, but they didn't notice me at first. They were busy with something. Each one held objects that seemed familiar, yet warped, distorted versions of ordinary things. One carried a clock with its hands spinning wildly backward. Another held a child's doll, its head too large for its body, its eyes staring blankly. A third was hunched over a map that shifted and twisted like liquid, the lines of roads and rivers rearranging themselves constantly. I should have turned back. I should have slammed the door and pretended I never saw it. But instead, I took a step forward. As soon as my foot touched the floor, they stopped. Every figure froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. No eyes, no faces, but I could feel them looking at me. The air grew heavier, pressing against my skin, and that low hum returned, vibrating deep in my chest. One of them, the tallest, took a step toward me. Its movements were wrong, like it was learning to walk for the first time. It raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and pointed at me. "You're not supposed to be here," it said. The voice didn't come from its body. It came from everywhere, echoing through the space like 1,000 whispers layered over each other. I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the hum. The door." "There was no door," it interrupted. The whisper voice grew sharper, colder. "Not for you." I stepped back, my pulse hammering. The figures began to move again, closing in, their jerky, unnatural steps echoing against the glassy floor. I turned and ran. The door was still there, standing impossibly in the middle of the infinite space. I threw myself through it and slammed it shut behind me. The hum stopped, and I was back in my bedroom. The clock ticked. The light through the curtains shifted. Time moved again. The door was gone. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd had some kind of waking nightmare, a trick of the mind. But then I noticed something on the floor, a shard of glass, no bigger than a coin, shimmering faintly in the morning light. When I picked it up, the surface rippled like liquid, and for a split second, I saw my reflection. It wasn't my face. Since that night, I've been trying to forget, trying to convince myself it was all a dream. But the hum comes back sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet. And a few days ago, I found another shard on my nightstand, even though I'd thrown the first one away. I can feel them watching, waiting, and sometimes when I close my eyes, I see the door again. It's closer now, closer every time. I was an insomniac before it all began, so I've always been awake for more of the night than most people. It was never a problem. I'd read, scroll my phone, or stare at the ceiling until I drifted off. But when the calls started coming, my nights changed forever. The first one came at 2:17 a.m. I was lying on my back, listening to the hum of my old window AC unit, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. I don't usually answer those, but something compelled me to pick up. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom. "Hello," I said, my voice hoarse with disuse. There was no answer, just a faint crackle of static, like an old TV tuned to a dead channel. I hung up after a few seconds and tried to go back to sleep, but the call stayed with me. It wasn't just the timing, it was the feeling. Something about it had left a greasy residue in my mind. The next night, the call came again. Same time, same unknown number. This time, I let it ring out. A minute later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. "You should answer." My stomach twisted. I stared at the screen, debating whether to block the number or respond. Before I could decide, the phone rang again. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Who is this?" I demanded. The static was louder this time, more insistent. Beneath it, I thought I heard a faint voice, too garbled to make out. "Whoever this is, stop calling me," I said and hung up. That night, I dreamed of nothing but static. The third night, the call didn't come. I stayed awake, staring at the phone, waiting for it to buzz. When it didn't, I felt an odd mix of relief and disappointment. It wasn't until the following morning, when I walked into my living room, that I realized it wasn't over. Every electronic device I owned was on. My laptop, my TV, even my ancient desktop computer I hadn't used in years. All of them were displaying static. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out with trembling hands. Another text. "Why aren't you answering?" I deleted the message and turned off my devices one by one. My stomach churned as I unplugged the desktop, convinced I'd find someone standing behind me when I turned around. But there was no one there, just me alone in the suffocating silence of my apartment. By the time the fourth night came around, I was too scared to sleep. I sat in bed with my phone in my lap, watching the clock tick closer to 2:17 a.m. When the call came, I didn't hesitate. I answered immediately. What do you want? I asked, my voice shaking. The static was there, as always, but this time, the voice was clearer. A woman's voice, distant and hollow, like she was speaking to me from the other end of a long tunnel. Help me, she said. I froze. Who are you? What's happening? Her reply was almost drowned out by the static. I'm here. I'm stuck. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Where are you? I asked, but the call cut out before I got an answer. The next morning, I noticed something strange. A faint, greasy residue on my phone's screen, as if someone had touched it with oily fingers. I wiped it off, trying to ignore the knot of unease in my stomach. The calls became more frequent after that. Twice a night, then 3 times. The woman's voice grew clearer with each call, and her pleas became more desperate. Help me, she said again and again. I'm trapped. Where? Who are you? Tell me what to do. I begged, but she never answered those questions. She only repeated her plea. And then things escalated. One night, I woke up to find my phone wasn't where I'd left it. It was on the floor by the window, its screen glowing faintly in the dark. I picked it up and saw a text. Look outside. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to throw the phone across the room and hide under the covers. But I couldn't resist. Slowly, I moved to the window and pulled back the curtain. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the empty street, washed in the sickly orange glow of the streetlights. Then I noticed the figure standing on the sidewalk directly across from my apartment. A woman. Her outline was hazy, as though she were slightly out of focus, and she wasn't moving. Just standing there, staring up at me. My phone buzzed in my hand. Another text. It's me. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. I didn't go back to sleep that night. In fact, I didn't sleep at all for the next 3 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, waiting. I stopped answering the calls, stopped reading the texts. I even smashed my phone, thinking it might stop the connection. It didn't work. The calls started coming through my TV, my laptop, even my microwave. The same static-filled plea. Help me. On the 7th night, she came inside. I don't know how. I had every door locked, every window sealed. But when I turned around, she was there. Closer now, no longer a hazy figure. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunk in pits that seemed to pull the light from the room. Help me, she said, her voice echoing in my skull. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor. She knelt in front of me, her cold hand brushing against my cheek. You're the only one who can hear me, she whispered. But now, you're with me. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, my apartment was empty. My phone was back on the nightstand, its screen unbroken, as though nothing had happened. But things aren't the same. I see her sometimes, reflected in windows or the blank screen of my TV. She doesn't speak anymore. She doesn't have to. Now the calls come from my number. And sometimes I answer. The piano wasn't there when I moved in. I was sure of it. I'd rented the apartment for its simplicity. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, a tiny kitchen barely big enough for a microwave. It was perfect for a fresh start. When I did the walkthrough with the landlord, it was empty aside from the appliances and a coat rack bolted to the wall near the door. So when I came home from work one evening to find an upright piano sitting in the corner of the living room, I thought I had walked into the wrong apartment. I double-checked the number on the door, 3C. My apartment. The piano was old, the wood dark and polished, with faded brass pedals and a slight warp to the keyboard lid. A faint layer of dust coated the top, and the bench was tucked neatly underneath, as if it had been there for years. I called the landlord immediately. He picked up on the second ring, his voice gruff. A piano? No, that's impossible. The last tenant didn't have one, and I sure as hell didn't put one there. Well, it's here, I said, pacing the room. Could someone have moved it in by mistake? He sighed. I don't know how they'd get it up the stairs. The elevator's been broken for weeks. Look, if it's bothering you, I'll come by tomorrow and take a look. I hung up, feeling uneasy. The piano didn't belong, but it wasn't threatening exactly. Just strange. I decided to ignore it for the night. The first sound came around 2 a.m. I woke to a single, low note, resonating through the stillness of the apartment. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me from sleep. I lay there for a moment, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. Nothing. Just the hum of the fridge and the faint creak of the building settling. The next morning, the landlord came by as promised. He ran a hand over the dusty surface, frowning. Weird. It doesn't look new. If someone moved it, they did it a long time ago. I shrugged helplessly. Can you get rid of it? He hesitated, then shook his head. Not today. I'll need a dolly, maybe a couple of guys to help. You're fine to leave it for now, though, right? It's not in the way. I didn't want to leave it, but I didn't argue. By the time I got home from work that evening, the piano seemed darker somehow, as if the polished wood had absorbed the shadows of the room. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light, and tried to ignore it. That night, the notes came again. A single, low tone, followed by a higher one. This time it didn't stop. The notes trickled out one by one, deliberate and eerie, like a child plunking out a tune they barely remembered. I crept out of bed, heart hammering, and flipped on the living room light. The music stopped. The piano sat there, silent and still, the keys untouched. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine as I backed into my room and locked the door. The next morning, the keys were different. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but as I walked past the piano, I noticed the once pristine ivory keys were now faintly discolored, smudged with dark, oily streaks. I rubbed at one with my thumb, but it didn't come off. That night, the music was louder, and this time, it was unmistakably deliberate. A melody, a slow, haunting waltz that wound through the apartment like smoke. I barely slept, and the next day, I called the landlord again. It's playing itself, I said, my voice rising. I don't care if it's possessed or broken or what, but you need to get rid of it. He was quiet for a moment, then said, You're sure you're alone in there? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. What do you mean? The last tenant, he said hesitantly. She left suddenly, just packed up one night and disappeared. Before she moved in, she said something about the piano too. Why didn't you tell me that before? Because it sounds crazy, he snapped. Look, I'll come tomorrow. We'll get it out, okay? I didn't go home that night. I stayed at a friend's place, only returning the next afternoon to let the landlord in. He brought 2 movers with him, and together, they hoisted the piano toward the door. Except it wouldn't budge. It's like it's bolted to the floor. One of the movers grunted, straining against the weight. That's impossible, the landlord said, crouching to inspect the base. He paled. There's nothing attaching it, but it's stuck. The movers gave up after an hour. You're going to need a specialist for this, one of them said, wiping sweat from his forehead. That night, I had no choice but to stay. The melody returned, more intricate now, weaving itself into a mournful, lilting tune. I pressed a pillow over my ears, but I couldn't block it out. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, the piano was in a different place. It was subtle, just a few inches to the left, closer to the center of the room. But it was enough to make my stomach churn. I called the landlord again, but he didn't answer. The movers wouldn't pick up either. I was alone with it. That night, I stared at the piano from the safety of my bedroom, willing it to stay still. The melody began at midnight, louder than ever, filling every corner of the apartment. And then it stopped, replaced by a new sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward my door. The handle twisted. When I finally worked up the courage to unlock the door, the piano was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. No scratches on the floor, no smudges on the keys. The movers denied ever coming to the apartment. The landlord stopped returning my calls. And every so often, late at night, I hear the melody again, faint and distant, as if it's calling me back. I noticed it first in the way my shadow moved. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, leaning over the sink, the fluorescent light buzzing faintly overhead. When I glanced down, I froze. My shadow didn't match me. My arm was raised, toothbrush in hand, but the shadow's arm hung limp at its side, still and unnatural. I blinked hard, shook my head, and looked again. It was normal, perfectly in sync. I tried to laugh it off, but my reflection looked back at me too intently. That night, As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The next time it happened, I couldn't write it off so easily. I was walking to the train station after work. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows ahead of me. I glanced down, absently watching my shadow stretch and shrink as I moved under streetlights. And then it stopped. My shadow stopped moving. I took another step. It didn't. It just stood there, frozen on the pavement like a photograph. Then its head tilted slightly, as though it were studying me. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. And then it moved, not to match me, but on its own, stepping forward, its feet making no sound. It started walking away, further down the street, as if it had somewhere to be. I staggered backward, almost falling. When I blinked again, it was gone. My shadow was back, stretching obediently in front of me like nothing had happened. I didn't take the train that night. I called a rideshare and kept my eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to look at the shadows pooling around the car. Things only got stranger after that. At work, my co-workers began acting like they knew something I didn't. They'd exchange glances when I entered the room, quickly hiding their smirks. One day, my manager said, "Hey, great job on the presentation yesterday," and I stared at him blankly. "What presentation?" He laughed like I was joking. "Come on, the client loved it. You nailed the pitch." I didn't remember giving a pitch. When I checked my emails later, I found dozens of messages referencing meetings, plans, and calls I didn't remember having. They weren't mistakes. I'd replied to them. Detailed, professional responses in my voice, with my signature. Except I hadn't written them. I tried asking a few coworkers what was going on, but their responses unsettled me more. "You've been really outgoing lately," one said. "It's a nice change." Another laughed nervously. "It's almost like you're a different person." I felt like I was going insane. My days began to split in two. The parts one remembered and the parts one didn't. Whole hours disappeared without a trace. And when I came to, I'd be somewhere new. Sitting on a park bench, standing in a crowded bar, or staring out a window I didn't recognize. Once, I woke up in a stranger's apartment. My hands were smeared with charcoal, and a half-finished drawing sat on the desk in front of me. It was a sketch of a person split down the middle, half light, half shadow. I didn't know how I'd gotten there. I didn't know how to leave. The more it happened, the more people started treating me differently. Friends said I was more confident lately, though I didn't feel it. They said I was going out more, being more spontaneous. It was like they were describing someone else entirely. And then came the videos. One morning, I woke up to a text from an old friend. "LOL, you're going viral," it read, followed by a link. I clicked it hesitantly, and my stomach dropped. It was a video of me, or someone who looked exactly like me, dancing in the middle of a crowded club. My movements were erratic, almost inhuman. My eyes shone unnaturally in the dim light. The caption read, "Is this girl okay?" I didn't remember being there. I didn't remember the smile on my face, wide and unhinged, or the way my body twisted and bent. More videos started surfacing. In one, I was walking through an unfamiliar neighborhood at night, staring up at the windows like I was looking for something. In another, I was sitting on a swing set, humming a tune I didn't recognize. I started avoiding mirrors, terrified of what I might see. But one night, I couldn't resist. I've been feeling it all day, that crawling sensation at the base of my skull, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned on the bathroom light and faced the mirror. My reflection stared back, but it felt wrong. It moved with me, but not perfectly. There was a hesitation, a slight delay, like it was waiting for me to lead. I raised my hand, and it followed, but its fingers bent in the wrong direction. I whispered, "What are you?" And it smiled. Not the kind of smile a person gives. A smile that stretched too wide, showing too many teeth. Its lips moved, but the voice came from inside my head. "I'm what you left behind," it said. The word sent a cold shock through me. "What do you mean?" I stammered, but the reflection didn't answer. Instead, it began moving on its own, its hands pressed against the glass. And for a moment, I thought it might push through. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the depths of the mirror. I don't know what's happening to me. I don't know if this is a haunting, or if I'm losing my mind, or if something is breaking loose inside me that I can't control. All I know is that the gaps are getting longer. The other night, I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of a highway, cars honking and swerving around me. My reflection in the glass of a passing car winked at me before vanishing. And last night, I woke up to find a note on my pillow, written in handwriting that was almost mine. It's my turn now. I don't know what that means, but I'm afraid I'm going to find out. The antique shop was smaller than Sylvia remembered, its cramped aisles stuffed with fading treasures and forgotten trinkets. It smelled like dust and aged wood, a scent that clung to her as she wandered between the shelves. She hadn't been here in years, not since her grandmother brought her as a little girl, but something had drawn her back today. Perhaps it was the dream she couldn't shake, or the nagging sense that the universe was trying to tell her something. The shopkeeper, a man who looked like he'd been carved from driftwood, nodded in her direction. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, his voice raspy with age. Sylvia nodded but didn't respond. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe nothing at all. The shop had a way of pulling you in, making you believe there was something here meant just for you. Her fingers grazed the edge of a tarnished silver mirror, a stack of leather-bound books, a porcelain doll missing an eye. And then she saw it, a small wooden box tucked behind a cluster of brass candlesticks. It was unassuming, its surface scratched and its corners worn, but something about it made her pause. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The latch was broken, hanging loosely, but the lid stayed shut. Sylvia frowned and tried to pry it open, but it didn't budge. "That one's stubborn," the shopkeeper said, appearing suddenly at her side. She flinched. She hadn't heard him move. "Do you know what's inside?" she asked. He shook his head. "Been here as long as I have, and that's saying something. People try to open it, but it never does. Maybe it's empty, maybe it's not. That's the mystery." Sylvia hesitated. She didn't need a wooden box. She barely had room for the things she already owned. But something about it wouldn't let her go. "How much?" she asked. The shopkeeper squinted at her, as if sizing her up. $15. "10, she countered, not because she cared about the price, but because haggling felt like a ritual in a place like this. "Done," he said with a grin, and before she could second-guess herself, the box was hers. When she got home, Sylvia set the box on her kitchen table and stared at it. The light from the window caught the scratches on its surface, turning them into tiny maps of forgotten worlds. She tried the latch again, pulling and twisting, but it refused to open. She almost gave up, almost left it there as a decoration or a conversation starter for the rare times she had guests. But then she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint engraving on the bottom of the box, so light it was almost invisible. She tilted it toward the light and squinted. It wasn't a word, exactly, more like a symbol, a spiral, or maybe a whirlpool. That night, she dreamed of water. A vast, endless ocean stretched out before her, dark and cold. She was on a small wooden boat, the kind that felt too fragile for the waves around it. In the distance, she saw the spiral, the same one from the box, glowing faintly beneath the surface. It pulled at her, a silent, irresistible call. She woke with a start, her heart racing. The box was still on the table, unchanged. But now it felt different, heavier somehow. She ran her fingers over the engraving again, her mind racing. What was it about this thing that felt so alive? Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Small, unexplainable things at first. The lights flickered when she walked into the room. Her cat, normally indifferent to everything, hissed at the box and refused to come near it. And then there were the whispers. They came at night, soft and indistinct, like voices speaking from far away. Sylvia couldn't make out the words, but they filled her dreams, blending with the ocean and the spiral until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. One evening, after another restless night, Sylvia decided to try something different. She lit a candle and placed it next to the box, hoping the flickering light might reveal something she'd missed. She ran her hands over the surface, pressing and prodding, searching for a hidden latch or a secret compartment. And then, without warning, the lid opened. Inside was a single object, a key, blackened with age but still intact. Sylvia held it up to the light, her breath catching. It was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with the same spiral pattern as the box. She turned the box over, searching for a lock, but there was none. The key didn't seem to belong to it, or to anything else in her apartment. For a moment, she considered putting it back, shutting the box, and forgetting she'd ever seen it. But something told her that wasn't an option anymore. The whispers grew louder that night, more insistent. They weren't just in her dreams now. They followed her into her waking hours, a constant murmur at the edge of her thoughts. And always, they led her back to the key. By morning, she knew what she had to do. The key wasn't meant to stay here. It had to be used, but for what? And where? Sylvia packed a bag with the essentials, clothes, water, a flashlight, and set out. She didn't have a destination in mind, only a feeling, a pull she couldn't explain. She walked for hours through streets she didn't recognize, until she found herself standing at the edge of a park she'd never been to before. At its center was a fountain, dry and cracked, its stone surface covered in moss. And at the base of the fountain, half hidden by weeds, was a lock. Sylvia's hands trembled as she knelt down and fit the key into the lock. It turned easily, as if it had been waiting for her. The ground rumbled beneath her, the fountain groaning to life. And then, just like in her dreams, the water came rushing in. When it was over, Sylvia found herself staring into the fountain's depths. At its center was the spiral, glowing faintly, and something else, a reflection, but not of her. It was someone else entirely, looking back at her with eyes that were both familiar and strange. And then the voice came, clear and steady, rising from the water. "You found your way back." Sylvia didn't know what it meant or what came next, but as she reached out to touch the water, she felt the pull again, and this time, she didn't resist. The laundromat wasn't anything special. It sat at the corner of Elm and Vine, wedged between a payday loan shop and a diner that always smelled like burnt toast. The sign above the door read Spin City in cracked red letters, and the inside was lit with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed just loud enough to drive you crazy if you stayed too long. I went there every Saturday, hauling my basket of clothes in just before 7 p.m. It wasn't crowded at that hour, which was perfect. I didn't want company, just a few quarters, a couple hours of quiet, and the hum of machines to drown out my thoughts. That's why I noticed her right away. She was sitting in the corner, next to the row of dryers, with a magazine in her lap that she wasn't reading. Her hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she wore a faded gray hoodie that looked 2 sizes too big. Her sneakers were scuffed, and her jeans were torn, but not in a stylish way. She didn't look at me when I walked in, but I felt her eyes on me the moment I turned my back. I chose a machine as far from her as possible and started loading my clothes. By the time I poured in the detergent and slammed the lid shut, she still hadn't moved. When the machine started, I glanced at her. She wasn't doing laundry. She didn't have a basket or a bag, not even a stray sock in sight. She was just sitting there. At first, I thought she might be homeless, using the laundromat to get out of the cold. It wouldn't have been the first time, but her hoodie was clean, her jeans weren't frayed at the edges, and her shoes, though scuffed, were intact. Something about her made me uneasy. I turned my attention to my phone, scrolling through nothing to pass the time. Every so often, I looked up, and each time, she was still sitting there, still staring down at that magazine like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Except she never turned a page. When my washer beeped, I transferred my clothes to a dryer, stealing a glance at her as I passed. Her head was still down, but her eyes flicked up, just for a second, long enough to meet mine. They were wrong. It wasn't the color or the shape. It was the way they looked at me, like she wasn't seeing me at all, like she was looking through me, past me, at something I couldn't see. I pretended not to notice and kept walking. The dryer was louder than usual that night. The whirring sound filled the room, drowning out everything else. I tried to focus on my phone again, but I couldn't stop thinking about her eyes. I looked up again, and this time, she wasn't in her corner. She was standing. Her back was to me, her hoodie pulled tight over her shoulders. She was facing the dryers, but she wasn't doing anything, just standing there, perfectly still, with her hands at her sides. I froze. The air felt heavier, like the room had shrunk. The lights flickered, just once, and I swear the buzzing got louder. I cleared my throat, trying to break the tension. You need a dryer?" She didn't answer. My voice sounded small in the empty room. I glanced at the door, wondering if I should just leave my clothes and come back later. Before I could decide, she moved. She didn't walk, didn't shuffle. She just turned. It was like a puppet being yanked on a string. Her whole body pivoted at once, stiff and unnatural, until she was facing me. Her face was wrong. Her skin was too smooth, too pale, like it had been stretched too tight over her bones. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her mouth didn't move, but I swear I heard her voice. "Do you remember me?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, low and flat, like a distant echo. I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. She tilted her head, just slightly, and took a step toward me. Her movements were jerky, disjointed, like she didn't quite know how to use her limbs. The lights flickered again, and for a moment, everything went dark. When they came back on, she was closer. Too close. I stumbled back, knocking over a plastic chair. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her mouth opened, impossibly wide, splitting her face in two. "Do you remember me?" The words echoed again, louder this time, reverberating in my skull. I didn't remember her. I didn't know who she was or what she wanted or why she was here. But she knew me. The lights went out again, plunging the room into darkness. I ran. I didn't care about my clothes, didn't care about the quarters I'd wasted. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the handle, throwing myself into the cold night air. When I looked back, the laundromat was empty. The lights were steady, the machines humming quietly, and she was gone. I never went back. A week later, I drove past the laundromat. It was boarded up, the sign above the door cracked in half. A man sweeping the sidewalk told me it had been closed for years. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the hum of the machines. And when I close my eyes, I see her face. "Do you remember?" I first noticed it in the mirror. Not my reflection. That was normal. Tired eyes, unkempt hair, the usual. It was behind me, a faint shifting distortion, like the air above a hot grill. I stared at it for a few seconds, thinking it was my imagination. Then I turned around. Nothing. Just my quiet apartment, lit by the weak glow of a single lamp. I shrugged it off and got ready for bed, though the unease lingered. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe the start of a migraine. I'd been stressed lately. That kind of thing messes with your head. The next morning, the distortion was gone. The day unfolded as uneventfully as days usually do. Emails, meetings, traffic. By the time I got home, I'd nearly forgotten about it. But when I walked into the bathroom to wash my face, I froze. The distortion was back, and it was bigger. It rippled like heat waves, but now it had depth, like something was moving behind a pane of frosted glass. I could feel its presence, an odd pressure in the air, as though the room itself were holding its breath. I didn't turn around this time. Instead, I stared at the mirror, heart pounding, and whispered, "What are you?" The distortion shivered, almost like it had heard me. Then it vanished. For the next few days, I tried to ignore it. It wasn't there constantly, but when it did show up, it was always in reflective surfaces. The bathroom mirror, the black screen of my TV, even the gleam of my toaster. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But one night, as I brushed my teeth, I caught it doing something that shattered my fragile sense of denial. It moved, not just a ripple or a shift. Something inside it leaned closer, as though trying to get a better look at me. For the briefest moment, I thought I saw an eye, dark and unblinking. My toothbrush fell into the sink, and I stumbled back, staring at the mirror in horror. The distortion didn't disappear this time. It lingered, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next week, the thing in the mirror grew bolder. It didn't just watch, it started mimicking. If I raised my hand to scratch my head, it would do the same a split second after I moved. But its movements were wrong. Slightly delayed, slightly too fluid, like it was trying to understand how my body worked. I stopped looking into mirrors. I covered them all with towels or turned them toward the walls. But it didn't help. The distortion started appearing in places that weren't reflective at all. In the shadows of my bedroom, in the corner of my living room, even on the blank white wall of my office. It didn't mimic me anymore. It just watched, waiting. One night, desperate for answers, I Googled shadows and mirrors and distortions following me. The results were useless. Paranormal blogs, ghost stories, vague mentions of shadow people. None of it felt real. I didn't want folklore. I wanted an explanation. Something concrete. That's when I noticed an email in my inbox. The subject line read, "You've been chosen." It was from an address I didn't recognize, just a string of numbers and letters that made no sense. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. The email was blank except for one sentence. "The observer is learning." I slammed the laptop shut and paced around my apartment, panic clawing at my chest. Who had sent that? How did they know? And what the hell did it mean? That night, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling like fabric brushing against the floor. It came from the bathroom. I grabbed the nearest object for a weapon, a broom, and crept toward the sound. The door was ajar, and the room beyond was dark. I pushed the door open, broom raised, and flipped on the light. The mirror was uncovered. I knew I had draped a towel over it earlier, but now the towel was on the floor. The distortion filled the glass, larger than ever, its edges vibrating like it was barely holding itself together. And then for the first time, it stepped out. It didn't crawl or ooze. It simply shifted, crossing the barrier between the glass and my world like stepping through a doorway. The air grew colder, and I couldn't move. The thing stood in front of me, taller than I'd expected, its body a swirling mass of shadows and shimmering light. It had no discernible features, just a vaguely humanoid outline. But I could feel its gaze, heavy and inescapable. "You see me," it said. Its voice wasn't a sound, but a vibration in my skull, like my thoughts weren't entirely my own. What? What do you want?" I whispered. "To understand," it replied. "You were the first to notice, the first to respond." "To what?" "To me." It leaned closer, and I could see faint threads of light weaving through its form like veins. "Your kind never looks. They glance, but they do not see. You do." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. "What are you?" "A watcher. A learner. I observe your world." It paused, as though choosing its words carefully. "But your awareness has disrupted things." "Disrupted what?" It tilted its head, a movement too smooth to be human. "The balance. Your attention has opened a path." I didn't understand what it meant, but I didn't have time to ask. The distortion around its body began to widen, spilling into the room like ink spreading in water. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all of it started to dissolve, replaced by the same rippling void I'd seen in the mirror. "What's happening?" I shouted, my voice cracking with terror. "You were not meant to see," it said, almost regretfully. "But now that you have, the path cannot be closed." I felt myself being pulled toward the void, my body weightless, my thoughts unraveling. The last thing I saw was the creature tilting its head again, as if curious. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my apartment. The mirrors were uncovered, the air felt normal, and the clock on the wall ticked steadily. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, but when I looked at my reflection, it didn't move. It just stood there, staring back at me with a faint, shimmering smile.